Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday, where we're going to talk about everything you need to know about this upcoming moot for the Lions Cup. We have the current, is it president? CEO, sorry, it's right there in her name, of the Lions Cup, Miss Cassandra Harvey. We have defense counsel who argued the case, Yogesh Gupta. We have the always a very personable, great character that is JP Rodriguez and myself. And so today we will be talking about everything, as I said, that you need to know. This case has great societal implications, especially when we're talking about racial profiling, charter rights, and public confidence in the justice system. And so a lot of the times I try to explain to the mooters that you need to understand that although this is an exercise and somewhat of a game, it's still you should still treat it as a serious endeavor because many of the times, as Yogesh will describe, when you're at this level of advocacy, you're creating common law. You're creating common law applications to whether it's definitions of what racial profiling is or what police should or should not be doing as far as what the courts deem to be appropriate. So this is very serious stuff. So, a lot of the times, a lot of mooters stick to their notes. They're trying to just get through their prepared, um, you know, I guess notes again. But in reality, they should be understanding that what they're asking for has real implications. And so, if you wanted any advice from me, I would just say to treat this as if though you were arguing both sides of for an actual client, understand what it is you're asking for. And I think the biggest takeaway that I would impart to you guys is to let your points breathe. Myself and JP have many a times compared mooting to the old art of hip hop battles, right? Rap battles. And when you drop a bar, you want the crowd to be able to react to that bar. If you continue to rap or provide submissions in this case, the justice or the judges won't have a chance to absorb or to even agree with what you just put forward, right? And so you need that time, whether it's a sip of water, a simple check of a piece of paper, whatever it is. Take those moments. Don't rush through it. Enjoy yourself. And you should also pat yourself on the shoulder because when you get into things like mooting, you're actually getting into the real core crux of advocacy, which is the ability to convince, right? The ability to put forward an argument and for a trier of fact to take that argument and agree to it, and that benefits your client, right? And we have a big thank you to Cassandra and her team who have, for the second year in a row, made sure that we have the prestigious, I guess, arena you could put in this case of the federal court, and it's actually quite rewarding. I was Chief Justice last year. I had the honor when our other Chief Justice got sick out of nowhere, and it was actually quite a fulfilling thing to do. And so I will get off the line now and give it to the people who matter. I'll let JP take over because he's your MC for the day. And again, thank you all for coming.
Perfect. And for those, if anyone here is not competing in the Lions Cup, obviously, and anyone listening to this later on, there is, a jam-packed group of, I think all the speakers are Osgood Cup champions over the years. Even Jen to wrap up at the end. I won't tell you what year she won in, but nonetheless, there's a lot of putting together, preparing for a moot. And if this is your first time mooting, I'm literally fresh off a drive back from Humber where I was judging the Paralegal Cup, and everyone in my round was mooting for the first time. And I think at least one of them was registered for this, so hopefully they do watch the recording. But there's a lot of things that go in to mooting, and I think over the course of today you're going to learn a little bit how to craft your submissions, prepare for questions, deliver oral advocacy to top notch. And of course, it comes from knowing the case. And today we are pleased to have criminal defense counsel Yogesh Gupta here, giving up his Saturday to tell you a bit about a case that went really well for him and that you are mooting. And shout outs again to Cassandra because this is an Ontario Superior Court of Justice decision, which is very rare. Cassandra, have you? I can't even think of another time it wasn't a Court of Appeal or Supreme Court decision. So I think it really is going to put the crosshairs on the participants to know the arguments. And we are blessed to have Mr. Gupta here to tell you about the side of the appellant well in the case. So thank you, Yogesh, and I'll turn it over to you. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll convey it.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So JP's right. This is a case that went really well for me. Not all cases do, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, but this is one of those cases where you get a certain set of facts that you realize right at the offset that this is going to be wonderful. Like there's so many issues, and you look at this case initially, and the way my client described it to me was this is a simple case of police brutality, right? This is a Section 7 excessive use of force argument, and cruel and unusual punishment under Section 12, and essentially the goal at that point becomes a stay of proceedings. Okay. Now, things shifted a lot because as I went through disclosure, you see that there are significant issues plagued throughout this entire investigation. A really short summary of what this investigation was. Essentially, two police officers are doing searches in a hotel parking lot for, sobriety, right? So they're looking at all the drivers that are around and they're asking them questions, and then if they want to investigate any further, they will. Two officers come and attend my client's vehicle, but it's kind of odd because as they do, they see him sleeping there. And so they don't actually ask him any questions. They sort of just tap on the window and then they go back to talking to each other. They run the plates and they find out that this car belongs to somebody by the name of Andrew Francis. And that Andrew Francis guy is wanted on a guns and gangs investigation out of Toronto. So instead of taking any further steps to ascertain his ID or, wake him up any further, they put strips out. So these are the kind of strips where if you drive over them, you'll get flat tires. So they put strips out, they block in his car, and they call for backup immediately. And again, at this point, they haven't done any further investigation. All they know is that there's a black man sitting in this vehicle sleeping. The vehicle's turned on. What happens next is about 15 minutes of them trying to get him out of the car. And during that time, there's no violence, but there are what I would characterize as threats of violence. And it's during this time that certain officers take a variety of steps that don't make sense in relation to an investigation into sobriety, right? Um, and eventually, once they decide that he's not going to step out and comply with this investigation, the officers decide to break the window and effectively start attacking him. At this point, he's already identified, by the way, that he is not Andrew Francis, right? So he's not the person that they're interested in that begins this investigation. But it comes to a point where the officers are now pissed off enough that he's not complying. And so they deem any action necessary to get him out as okay, right? Kosher. That's where we took issue, and that's how Justice Mirza sort of frames his decision, right? There's a change, and it's that change where all these problems begin to cascade. The original problem is this investigation into sobriety, which we said was a Section 9 abuse of his charter rights, that he should not be arbitrarily detained. And Justice Mirza found that that was also present. But it's really all of the breaches that cascade afterward that open up this line of analysis that leads to racial profiling. I'm not going to go over the minutia of what each officer says. I think Justice Mirza does a fantastic. It's a very long decision, and he does a fantastic job outlining all of the facts of this case. He was able to sort of see through the lies that officers were willing to tell that on the stand. What I say as lies, he wouldn't, but that's fine. He's the judge, and he was able to see through all of that and confine his decision to his perspective of what they're telling him and how he saw or what he saw actually occurred. And that was really neat because then what happens is that he's able to, you know, chop off each leg of the Crown's case or the Crown's response to the charter breaches that we alleged. Um, some of the most significant charter breaches in this case, aside from the actual force used, which was excessive in all regard, he's being hit with a baton, he's being pepper sprayed, he's being tased nonstop, he's being struck from both ends. I mean, it was almost merciless, right? But beyond that, there were certain legal issues, or I should say, breaches related to his legal rights. That being his 10A rights, his 10B rights, which were extreme. So, for example, one of the things that really got me in the case was, and I would argue that this breach alone, had nothing else happened, would have been enough to exclude the evidence. Um, was after he was arrested, he was taken into the vehicle, or the cruiser, and the officer began questioning him in regards to his name. At this point, Mr. Murray had already identified himself as Alex, and now he was identifying himself as Alexander Murray. The officer, two things happened here. One, the officer was told by another not to do that. He said, listen, his ID doesn't matter, just give him the RTC, just get him to the station, right? We don't want to lose this case because you're mucking about with the investigation. And what ended up happening is that officer didn't listen. He continues asking him about his ID. And in fact, when he identifies himself as Alexander Murray, the officer says to him, no, I know you're Andrew Francis. That is a key indicator as to the police's sort of foray into racial profiling. Because you have an older black man who's sitting there identifying himself as person A, and you have a belief that this is actually person B, and your belief is based off of nothing except for he's the one sitting in that vehicle, right? That's not sufficient. So at that point, it becomes okay, really what this belief is based off of is that he's that black guy, right? What this treatment was based off of is he's that black guy. And what Justice Mirza says really eloquently in his decision is, if this was a white man at a Four Seasons, would this have happened to him? Right? Or is it because he's a black man at a Hampton Inn or whatever the hotel was? So the 10B issue sort of starts from there, but it extends further. And one of the key ways that it extends further is that as he's taken into the ambulance, he's taken with an officer by the name of PC Dove. Now, PC Dove actually, during the physical interaction, was not as aggressive and actually tried to calm things down. But he makes a very serious mistake. He tells Mr. Murray that Mr. Murray will get access to a lawyer because Mr. Murray has been asking incessantly for access to a lawyer. So he tells him, listen, we'll get you access to a lawyer. I can't do it in the ambulance right now, but we'll get it there. And he starts reading off the RTC, the way that officers do in sort of like a checklist sort of way. And one of the things that he reads off is the number for legal aid. Now, Alexander Murray is sitting cuffed in a stretcher inside the ambulance. He's not going to remember that number. And so he tells him, he's like, listen, I can't see anything. He's already been pepper sprayed in the eyes. I can't see anything. I can barely hear you. He's in a loud ambulance. I want you to write that number down. And Dove says he would do it. Not only does he not do it, but for the next 6 hours that he's in the hospital, they don't get him any sort of phone to contact a lawyer. Now, what's interesting is that the body-worn camera footage was available, but it's all blurred out because there's a lot of privacy issues within a hospital. The one thing you could tell, however, is that officers are standing around talking, they're writing notes, they're really doing nothing. And they don't do anything, especially to get him a phone to contact police or to contact a lawyer. And he doesn't get that until 8:30 in the morning or just after, when he gets to the station, right? So you're at the hospital for 5, 6 hours and you've not taken any action, even though you've not only have you provided him with RTC, you've also promised him a certain thing and then not done that, plus not taken any action to contact a lawyer. That was an egregious breach. And it's something that the Supreme Court case of Taylor talks about, in the sense that, when you're hospital are not charter-free zones. Just because somebody's there doesn't mean that the circumstances become such that you don't need to respect an individual's constitutional rights, whether that's asking them further questions that might be incriminating, whether that's not engaging with them with their 10A and 10B rights, or whether that's treating them in a way, or searching their belongings, right? Hospitals don't become that charter-free zone. And so that, I would argue, in and of itself was enough to exclude the evidence. Originally, I was not attacking the racial profiling aspect, and there was a reason for that. All of these issues were enough to essentially get the evidence excluded. I knew that, and I knew that I had to make the strongest argument available to me. It was during the course of cross-examination that it became apparent that race may have played a role. And it was at the end, when we got to submissions, when the judge realized I wasn't raising racial profiling, that he started asking questions about it. And that's how we got into the discussion of Lee. So you guys have read the decision, you know the facts, you see where the case ended up. Originally, like I said, I didn't bring racial profiling, so I didn't bring a stay application, although I would argue that a stay application would likely have been successful. Certainly, an exclusion of evidence application was all that I needed, and definitely there was enough there for it to be successful. And so that's sort of where we stuck to. It was a tactical decision at trial. Would this case have furthered the law on stays had we gone for the stay? Probably. But it furthered the law in terms of 24-2, and so I'm pretty pleased with that. Yes, Cassandra, I see you have your hand up.
So, did the Crown originally, did they deny the allegations of the racial aspect, or were they just denying or submitting arguments on like the charter breaches itself
Both.
without the race aspect?
Both. So the race aspect got brought significantly later on, and in their factum, the Crown was simply denying the allegations that we had raised, right? It sort of caught both of us off guard, the way that Justice Mirza had raised this potential issue. And so, and this is, again, this kind of thing that happens over trial. He brings it up in the morning. Turns out lunch is no longer a lunch. And now I'm doing a ton of research on racial profiling, talking to every lawyer I can in the lawyer's lounge, and then getting back up there in the afternoon, making submissions. And then the way that Justice Mirza is, he wants everything done efficiently and effectively. Even though we had Monday reserved to make further submissions, he wants written submissions by 9 a.m. tomorrow. So it caught both of us off guard. That being said, the Crown in submissions took the position that he was not racially profiled, and that this was just a consequence of the investigation, that he happened to be a black male sitting in this car, and that the police had it, didn't treat him any differently just because he was a black male. And obviously, Justice Mirza, being who he is, did not buy that for a second. And I think the actions of the officers speak for themselves. I know you guys are mooting, so you guys are going to be talking about appellate law and how one would appeal this decision. Everybody has different perspectives on what their strongest ground of appeal is. Some might say, originally this wasn't a Section 9 breach, right? Or some might say that the 10A breach was a little, soft, because he was told that the officers are there for a sobriety investigation, which is enough to communicate that they're there for an impaired investigation, right? You don't have to use exactly the same words that are in the code. And some might argue that the 10A with respect to an obstruction of justice was a bit ridiculous, given the fact that he was essentially obstructing justice by not complying with the police's demands. And so some might take that angle as their strongest ground of appeal. I would argue that the strongest ground of appeal would be to go after the racial profiling. And that's because essentially the law on racial profiling leaves a lot to be sort of understood through the facts of the case, right? And it becomes a very sort of subjective ground. And I think one if was to argue that this case didn't meet that sort of bar of racial profiling, could take a look at the law that surrounds racial profiling and say that it sort of doesn't meet, what has happened in other cases where, police may not have had previous identity and may have just been acting and treating somebody differently because, of the color of their skin or the way they look. And so those are how I see if there was if there was to be an appeal, how they would appeal it. That being said, I could tell you right now, Sarah and I have known each other for a very long time. Sarah Burton was the crown on this case. And in fact, one of the first trials I ever did was with Sarah. And so, like I said, we go back a long time and we talked very casually and very frankly about this case. And I knew that based on what she was saying, there was no way that the Crown would appeal this. It A, was not worth their time. B, there were so many other issues in this case that even if the case was appealed, the concern was that the other charter breaches, like the 10B one that I described in length, was enough to maintain the 24-2 exclusion. And so I think that's where the Crown would have a very hard time appealing this case. Any
Yeah, I
questions?
guess I'll jump in here on um, potentially, right? Like if you're saying if Andrew Francis happened to be white and your client happened to be white, the argument could be, well, the rough treatment was due to the fact that it's a potential serious criminal rather than the color of the skin, right? Like that they could say, well, just he happened to be black. If he was white and it was a white suspect, it may have gone down the same way, right? But um, what are your
So
thoughts on that? Or
So the argument is there, but it's not just about, the fact that they're using the color of his skin to ID him. It's not just about that. It's the idea is, would a white person, if say Andrew Francis was a white male, right? Would Andrew Francis, being a white male, have been treated in that way? And I think the argument that Justice Mirza makes in his sort of in his description is no. Like this is something that clearly looks like, police have taken advantage of the fact that this guy is black and have acted in a way that they would not otherwise have acted. Right? The links to Andrew Francis, the fact that he's a lone black man sitting in a vehicle that's turned on, that he, doesn't want to respond or that he's scared of police, uh, as the other witness who had come down had clearly indicated, there's 6 officers surrounding him. Of course, he's scared, right? He doesn't want to come out. Can I open the door? Right? Can I come in? Can I open the door so he doesn't feel like you're all going to attack him at once? Um, those things were linked to the racial mistreatment. And so I don't think if this was Andrew Francis or if Andrew Francis was a white male, that he would have been treated the same. I think that's where the difference lies. There's ways to connect racial profiling, but there's a certain aspect of how of racial mistreatment that Mirza really goes after that I think is key to this particular case.
yeah, another question or point, it actually works out because I have experience. I'm one of the duty counsel that answers the calls in the middle of the night. But that when you brought up the 10B, because like again, I've advised people in the hospital that it literally takes them 5 seconds to make the phone call, leave a voicemail, or even get a live thing, and you'd get a response. And usually they would leave the room and say, I've put it on my speakerphone here, and I'm going to hand the phone to your client, and we're going to step out. And if there's any doctors or nurses or anything, we'll have them step out as well, and he can get that 5 minute call. Like, did anything of like that come up? As you've pointed out, that 10B seems to be the most egregious of the breaches in terms of access to legal aid. Did that point have to be made or rebutted, let's say, by the Crown to say, well, what's the big deal that he waited till 8:30 in the morning to talk to a lawyer because they didn't question him perhaps until the morning?
So the Crown certainly took the position that they had not questioned him, although it was kind of rebuttable on the facts given that, one officer had clearly asked him, "Is this your chunk?" Meaning gun, right? And the questions that were in the cruiser, that uh, with one perspective might seem like they're trying to get him to incriminate himself. Now, the the Crown took the position that that's 6 hour delay or whatever is something that can be seen otherwise as not a breach, but if it is seen as a breach, isn't enough to merit the exclusion. The problem is that Brampton is a cesspit of 10B breaches. Like, this is not unorthodox for Brampton, right? The Court of Appeal came out 6 years ago in Thompson, and in it did sort of like what in science you do like a systemic review, did a systemic review of cases in Brampton where it was so, vividly clear that that Peel Regional Police has an issue with 10B. And the fact that that's, decision comes out 6 years ago, and then you've got, 110B cases a year, and then you end up with a case like this where it's like, come on, right? And these officers aren't rookies, you know. I think the youngest officer was 3 years out, and the oldest officer was 20 years out, right? So that this wasn't a case where the officers could take the perspective that they didn't know what they were doing or that they don't understand that the hospital isn't a charter-free zone. Some of these officers were officers when Taylor came out, right? And so you would assume that, especially after the Thompson, the Court of Appeal case of Thompson, uh, and um, and over the past 6 years, that officers have been trained to really take a second look at whether or not they're doing their RTC properly. And again, we can't ever forget that RTC is not just the informational component. It is very much more importantly, the implementational component, right? The part where they actually get to speak to a lawyer, and police have made actual efforts, right? And I know the Crown said, there might be a 10B breach, but leave it alone. It's the promise of providing him with the number. A number of times this happened in the ambulance where Murray said, I need a written copy of the number. It's that promise. It's the ease of just writing the same number you've read off on a memo book, tearing it off and giving it to the guy. Right? It's the ease of doing something like that. And a promise so significant that is later not fulfilled or left unfulfilled for hours, that remains the crux behind that 10B breach. And then again, these things are never seen in isolation. You combine it with the 10A breach, you combine it with the original Section 9 breach, and then the Section 9 breach later on, following the arrest. And now you're playing with, I would argue that the Crown is playing with fire, right? It's like, if I manage to put out this one, I think the fire will come out here. And if I manage to put out that one, this one over here will keep burning. Either way, the building's going down. And I think it became, because we were plagued with breaches, it became such a problem that you can't really respond to everything. You can't say after so many repeated breaches that it was just the police were acting in good faith, right? Combine that with, the brutality, just like the video.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have seen the videos, right? A short video was published in the Star. And so I don't know if you guys have seen that or the longer body worn camera videos, which you can access as exhibits from the court. It's brutal. Like, it is horrifying the way this man is screaming. And he's not a young man either. This guy's in his like mid 40s, right? My knees hurt and I'm in my mid 30s. Imagine getting a baton to your knees in your mid 40s. You're not going to walk around very well. And Murray still has some issues with the way that they've arrested him that exist today, right? And that's part of another lawsuit. So
Yeah, and I think so. Then, if you're looking at this, Yogesh, as a mooter, I mean, and you can obviously look at both sides here, but is the way to frame it as a totality of the breaches? Sometimes an individual breach may not be enough. I mean, also looking at the 24/2 analysis, right? The Grant Testa, like, would you say for advice for these mooters, should they pick sections or maybe pick a couple of the sections and then look at the brutality on itself, or would you want to look at an analysis where you kind of capture, the totality of the situation and say, well, on its face, everything combined is why it meets the threshold?
Okay, to be fair, I've done one moot in my career. I won it and I called it quits because you end on a high. But if we're talking about from the perspective of a respondent, then yes, not only are you responding in relation to the totality, which is where the natural argument lies, but I think because the Crown's job, is not to break the Crown's job in this case, or the appellant's job in this case, is not to break down the totality. It's to break down each individual breach so that the totality breaks down on its own, right? And so as long as you can take away some of the things that cascade, you can, as an appellant, you can make the argument easier for yourself. The respondent, however, has to argue both, right? They've got to show that the Crown is wrong in respect of each individual breach, and then bring the argument back into the totality. Which is why, again, I think the appellant is more likely to find, some real juice if they go after the racial profiling ground, if they go after the racial mistreatment ground, because that is a way for them to attack the totality without having to take a look at each individual thing, right? And that's enough. That might be enough for, to get to a new 24-2 analysis. That's what's key here. Because again, the Crown can't show, in my opinion, that the evidence shouldn't be excluded. What the Crown can do is make a better law for themselves and show that racial profiling should not have been the answer to these breaches based on the totality, based on the aggressiveness of the use of force. I think the best the Crown can do is change the law so that at least judges are not, or are holding racial profiling to a higher standard. That I think is probably the best the Crown can get away with, because even after you take that away, you're left with everything else, and everything else still amounts to an exclusion, even if three judges on a panel were to do another analysis of the exclusion. Yes, Cassandra.
Oh, okay, you're doing an excellent job at explaining everything. I just want to make sure, because not to get competitors confused. So for the purposes of the moot, I think we should tread very lightly about changing the law with respect to not holding racial profiling to such a high standard, only because we're dealing with judges who are going to take that and they're going to put you into like the deepest, darkest hole with questions of like, well, then should we not consider racial profiling at all? And do you not care about, marginalized people and people of color? So be very careful in your submissions when you are making those arguments to not say that it doesn't matter at all, but I think to, have like a healthy balance of considering racial profiling, but then also protecting, this is greater society and everything. Yogesh, I did have a question because we have a lot of material from defense, and Justice Mirza did an excellent job in his reasons. So if you could kind of put on a crown hat for a second, and what if you were appealing, what would be the main things that you would focus on with the legal issues that I've written in the chat? What would you focus on, and how would you try to persuade the judge to obviously rule in your favor? Just because I wish we had Sarah here. She could provide so much perspective. We have her written submissions and her factum as well, but I think it would be a little bit more helpful because many competitors have expressed that they're struggling a bit with the Crown side, rightfully so. It didn't go in their favor. So if you could just elaborate a bit more.
Sure. Okay, so I'll start with the first question regarding the arbitrary detention. Okay. I think if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the arbitrary detention that you're referring to is regarding the initial stop. Is that right? Okay. The case that you're going to look at for that is McColeman. So McColeman was a case which was about impaired investigations on private property. And actually, I know the Crown that argued it at the Supreme Court. He's a judge now in Hamilton. And he made a really good argument, right? For crowns, a lot of the time it's about sort of saving the baby, right? We know that there's a breach. We get it. Um, and in McCollman, the way that the Supreme Court decided to sort of phrase it is that impaired driving is such a scourge on society that even if detention is arbitrary, that the evidence should be included. And that goes to specific impaired evidence, but it's something that uh, was taken into consideration and has been applied all throughout, to my chagrin, in the years that came after. Now, the original detention itself, right? A Crown might say, well, look, in McCollman, we have a situation where he's being stopped on private property, which is the same situation here, but the police have to do their investigation. In this particular case, right, the vehicle is turned on. He's clearly in care and control, and what police need to do to further their investigation is just reasonable grounds to suspect, not reasonable grounds or reasonable and probable grounds. So then it becomes, well, what about the strips in the back and what about the blocking of the vehicle, right? And I think that's where the appellant sort of leans on the fact that this is still just an impaired investigation, because the moment, those strips come out and the block goes on, that there's a belief that something else might be going on here. Right. And it was in this case, right? We know that they were looking into the guns and gangs investigation into Andrew Francis. And so it's important at that time to, as a Crown, to try and lean on the law that suits you. And I know that's, some might argue that that's being a bit disingenuous, right? You're not, as a minister of justice, you're supposed to really cover all the facts and cover all the law, whether it suits you or not. But if you're trying to win a moot, I mean, this is what you do. And you might get asked questions about it, right? You might get asked questions like, hey, what about this? What about that? And it's your job to sort of be on top of it and try to come up with answers. And I know I certainly, like, if I was, judging a moot, or if I was asking questions, I'd ask you questions specifically about the roadblocks and all that stuff. And I think you might be well suited to look up case law that responds to that well. Cases like, for example, the kinds of things that they do at ride stops, right? What is police normally doing at a ride stop? Are they putting out the strips? Are they blocking? Oh, I didn't know that they knew that. Okay. Are they blocking? Are they, what sort of steps are they taking to further their investigation? And if you can mirror it to the way that ride stops are done, or you can mirror it to the way that other impaired investigations are done, you found yourself on strong footing to argue specifically that arbitrary detention. To begin with, it's after that where your problems will begin. Second question is, okay, did the trial judge err in finding any of the breaches? If yes, what findings were in error? Okay. I'm going to address 7 first, 7 and 12 together, because they're best friends. Section 25 of the code allows for police to take whatever action is necessary in order to apprehend a suspect, right? The argument becomes that this guy is not complying with this investigation. And if you find that the investigation was lawful, then you should find that the use of force was lawful at the end of the day. Because if he's not complying with the investigation, I'm just arguing this as a Crown. I would never actually say this in court. But if the investigation is lawful, then the police have to do what they can to try and get him to comply. And he's clearly, for a 15, 16-minute period, when the police technically aren't doing anything violent, right? Except for, all of the other stuff that goes on, like the people surrounding him and the tapping and knocking on windows, the shining the flashlight in the face. They're not technically being violent, right? And it's at that point in time where if this person is not willing to comply with the investigation, he's not even willing to roll down his window the whole way, then what option do police have but to enter the vehicle? What option do they have? Right? And then at that point, the investigation goes from an impaired investigation to an possible impaired, and also clearly what the police consider an obstruction of justice. And so now you have to arrest him, because he's obstructed justice by not taking part in this investigation in a compliant manner, quote unquote, lawful investigation. And that's where your use of or your defense of the use of force begins. And I think it continues in the sense that he's trying to move the car, or he's, moving the steering wheel around. He's trying to put the car in gear, all that kind of stuff. I think that, adds to it, right? The fear of the police is increasing along with his actions, right? So he takes a step, they take a step. He takes a step, they take a step, as opposed, and it just increases, as opposed to the defense, who would likely argue the police put him in a position where he had no option but to take a step, and then every time the police escalated their aggression, he responded by trying to protect himself. So those are the two sides of that argument. The section 8. Just give me a second here. I got to take a look at this. Sorry, I'm gonna need a moment.
Also, sorry if my question completely threw us off the timeline, John Paul. I
It's okay,
apologize.
Cassandra. I mean, I think it's important, and as long as Anna Sophia and Neha are okay, I think we had a break right after them, so there will probably be no break now. But I think, and most people will be listening to the recording, so I'm sure it'll be fine. No worries. I think it's good to get the information, and I will try to reach out to Sarah Burton. Maybe I can use Yogesh, since he mentioned that they know each other. Maybe he can put a little elbow grease for me, because it'd be great to hear the other side as well, and then I can combine these together and go with it.
Great. Yeah, sorry. There's been, like, I totally recognize this is a very difficult case for an undergraduate moot. I've heard the feedback, so I wanted to make sure that I was kind of addressing or asking questions about competitors' concerns.
Yeah, so yeah, if and I think that would benefit if we can get, or even any crown, right? If any crown were tasked with the appeal, if they say we want to appeal this decision because of A, B, and C, what would you do, right? And I think that would maybe be helpful. So I'll endeavor to try to get that in the next couple of weeks, and then add it to this information.
Do you want me to keep going with the
Yeah, I mean,
9?
anything else that, or points 3 and 4, if you think, either what do you feel are the most strongest grounds there, maybe to wrap up in the next couple minutes.
So I think I answered 3 with my discussion about the combination of the discussion about the 9 and the 7. Um, Point number 8, and sorry, point 2. I think the 10A and the 10B were already discussed with respect to, or at least the 10B was, with respect to, whether or not he's ever truly given RTC. I just like to say, 8 is, don't get tricked with 8. 8 always follows 9, right? So just, it's a warrantless search. A warrantless search is de facto, unconstitutional. It's a breach. And if the investigation is unlawful and the detention is unlawful, so's the search, right? So don't get tricked up about that. I'm just going to address number 4, and then I think that should be it. And I've said this a couple of times while I've been rambling on, but the appellant needs to argue that 24-2 is an issue, right? If they were going up to the Court of Appeal, they would argue that, because these breaches aren't really breaches, the court needs to go into a new analysis. And it's the submissions that happened at that point that are relevant. So I think what needs to be covered in after getting rid of as many breaches as possible. I think in the 24-2 analysis, what needs to be covered is you're not going to do very well on the second leg of the grant test, because the impact to the accused is obviously extreme. What I think is better for the Crown to argue is that first leg, where you're saying that the officers are just following what they had to do. They didn't have another option, right? The officers couldn't just let him go, and they couldn't get him to comply. So the actions that they took, viewed under the first leg of grant, meant that they weren't, this wasn't on the high end of breaches, right? This was on the low end. The police were acting in good faith with that 16-minute encounter where it's peaceful, right? Where it turns aggressive, it's on Murray. And I think that is the best argument to be made with respect to the 24-2 analysis. I'll end it off by saying that guns and drugs, again, scourge in Peel region especially. So your third prong analysis should favor inclusion, even, should favor inclusion. And all you need to do as a mooter is try and convince the triers that, or the panel, that as long as you can see that the officers engaged in good faith, that should be enough to overturn the exclusion of the evidence. And I think that's where I should leave it off.
Thank you so much for taking the time and thoroughly going through that and even putting on, auditioning for maybe one day a crown role there. But I know it's very difficult as defense counsel, especially when you're obviously so engrossed in this case and your client and everything that's going on with it to take that position. So I really appreciate that as well. And I think it gives a lot of ammo for those mooters here and even just somebody interested in this case. I mean, it's been obviously covered and a lot of people have done some analysis. And so it's great to just get that perspective that we don't get fortunate enough to speak to counsel about how did it all went down. And even just the perspective of learning that, the racial profiling wasn't like this 2-year process or 18 months or however long it took to get to trial, that it kind of came up because Justice Mirza said, hey, let's hear about submissions and you have till 9 a.m. tomorrow in writing to deliver that. And I think that's a good lesson in advocacy as well, that for mooters, you got to pivot because Mr. Justice Rochester here, I'm sure when he's judging, will ask you a question that has nothing to do with what you prepared, and you got to be ready to go with the punches. So thank you so much for taking the time. And if you can hook up the crown there, Sarah Burton, help me with that. That would be great too. But thank you so much again for all of this, and we really appreciate it. And thanks, Cassandra and others for all your questions. And we'll segue right into our next set of speakers right now. So thanks again, Yogesh. You're on mute, Yogesh. You almost made it through with the.
If it's okay, JP, I'm going to leave my email in the chat. If anybody
Yep.
wants to get in touch, they want to know more, I'm happy to help.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right.
All right, and next up, so again, whether you're competing in the Lions Cup, and I think most of you who are listening to this recording or are here live are, but if not, or I think I see as some of my colleagues who are teachers and instructors and professors who may be wanting to introduce mooting into your curriculum, I think the rest of our agenda is focused on general guidance, in terms of being a successful mooter, especially for anyone here who's a first-time mooter listening to this. And it starts with crafting your submissions. And we are really honored here to have, I was going to put my Bruce Buffer announcer voice, the reigning, defending 2026 Osgood Cup champions, Anna Sophia Flores and Neha Gupta. And Anna Sophia, I believe, I don't know if you remember, but I've known you as a mooter since you were in high school. I think you were winning competitions that
Yes,
I was
John.
involved
I do remember
way back
in
then. So
COVID
really,
times.
so thank you so much for both joining us and being patient. And feel free if you need whatever extra time because we had a little break afterwards that we're good to go. And we're happy. I know you have stuff to show here first. And thanks again for joining us and congratulations on all your success over the years in mooting.
Thank you very much. Neha and I are so excited to be able to share the accumulation of our mooting careers with you folks. Per the tagline of the event, we're going to be teaching y'all how to structure persuasive legal arguments with clarity, flow, and effective organization. But the real gem of what we're going to share with you is actually our partner dynamic that allowed us to, of course, win the Osgood Cup this year, which was amazing. But also, we won both of the competitions we prepared. We also won UFC Cup this year. So there's a method to this madness, and we're excited to share it with y'all. Neha, if you'd like to say anything.
No, that you pretty much covered it. But to get into the specifics of what we'll be going through, we've broken down our presentation. We're using visual aids because we think that it would help for us to speak and show you practically what the advice we're giving looks like on paper when you're prepping submissions or when you're reading. So our 3 phases of prepping for a moot. first understanding, strategizing, then structuring. And we're going to walk you through the anatomy of how we approach a moot, but also approach a case. And then we'll end with questions. So I'll let Anna Sophia start us off on this
Sure.
side.
So phase one is understanding. Um, I feel the need to emphasize that this is the longest phase. It's actually almost the entirety of our preparation process. I'm aware of other mooters. Wow, I shouldn't have put my hair behind my ears. That looked crazy, y'all. Okay, I'm aware of other mooters who, they just write a script, try things out, prioritize having something to say. I don't recommend it. I think that a lot of the positive feedback we've received from judges is about the depth of our legal knowledge, and it comes from this type of partner dynamic. So we would meet every single day for about an hour. And I know that sounds maybe crazy to some of y'all, but it was, at a time where we could constantly meet. So always like at a really late hour because we had conflicting schedules. And really, it was just us discussing for an hour, sort of like just having a conversation with a friend about the case that you already have on your mind. The requirement for us was always to be reading material between the meetings so that we could critically talk about what we had read. And that means putting your ego aside when you're with your partner and admitting that you have questions and actually interrogating what you don't understand and trying to workshop potential answers, but then sort of making sure that you can see whether or not your answer that you're coming up with is actually supported by the text. Neha put a quote from me in the I didn't put a quote from me, okay? That would be crazy. But she quoted me saying that you should be a judge in the margins. And what I meant by that is that when you're reading the decision, don't again put both your ego aside and also forget that these are, some of the most amazing, bright legal minds in the world and argue in the margins. Ask questions the way that you would if you were trying to poke holes in someone's argument. That's where the questions that you're going to explore in your meetings with your partner comes from. It's those sticky points that you identify, trusting your intuition about what does or doesn't work in an argument in the case. And something of note is that if we hadn't prepared enough for a meeting, if we hadn't developed any newer understanding, if we found ourselves asking the same questions but not knowing the answers to it, we would skip a meeting. We found that it was better to do shorter calls, check-ins if we weren't actually able to develop our understanding between meetings, and that ultimately we didn't want to waste each other's time. I think one of the most incredible things about working with Neha, and I hope she feels the same way about me, is that I think that I really felt the intellectual respect that she gave to me, and I really attempted to show her the intellectual respect I had for her, and that meant being very, very diligent about engaging with each other in those meetings very actively.
And to add on to that, I also think that can be a source of frustration if you're coming back on a larger policy issue or you're not quite understanding what the case is attempting to tell you in very sometimes convoluted jargon. It can also just eat up a lot of your time in amidst confusion. And having a partner, being a collaborative activity in its very nature, allows for you to play off of speaking to someone else, getting someone else's opinion on or their take on the case, picking their brains as to what they might have read that you haven't read before. So also lean on the fact that mood is supposed to be this way. You're supposed to be able to lean on the person that you're working with. As for what would go on in the meetings, the purpose, again, as Anna Sophia said, was to come to meetings to be critical about what we had read. And how we would guide our meetings would be starting with questions. And we mainly had three categories of questions that we would ask. Most commonly, there would be clarification questions. And what that would look like was, I don't understand what this paragraph means. What do you think it means? Another big category of questions was differentiating between the majority and the dissent. You might have a concurrence, but what this idea or this category of question looks like is understanding conceptually why the different justices disagree or don't see eye to eye on the same legal issue before them. maybe they're relying on different case law, maybe they're pulling off of different policy concerns. Those large conceptual differences were important for us to flesh out as a pair, not only to understand ourselves what the fundamental difference was between our appellant and respondent submissions, and as a result, what authorities we needed to lean on, but also in responding to the concerns of the bench. Because once you have a clear idea of what the bench's concerns are, knowing that their concerns mirror the concerns in the record, either the Supreme Court of Canada's case, but in this case, I know we're working with an Ontario Superior Court case. So, same concerns conceptually, really. Why do the different justices see the same issue in a different way? And then our last category of questions was the significance of legal disagreements. And this is where a lot of frustration can, I think, arise, or a lot of confusion can arise. The nature of that question would look like, why does X concern matter, or how much does it matter? This can help you in structuring your submissions because you're able to identify how much weight to give to particular issues. And it can also help in guiding concessions, i.e., we don't need to make this argument, it'll eat up too much of our time, so we're just going to set it aside because we have other things to get to. The priority from our meetings would be to actually locate textually supported legal answers to our questions, not just we're going to put this question aside because we don't know how to quite deal with it. We weren't wanting to be satiated by setting a question aside because we knew if the both of us had a question, the justices would likely have that same question for us by the time that comp weekend rolled around. So we did want to find an authority of a sorts, even if it's not black and white letter law, but a compelling articulation of why the answer to our question is sound and can be convincing to ourselves, but hopefully also to a justice. So what that would look like is looking into citations as we debated. So while we were on our calls, we didn't, in that same vein, delineate necessarily between we're going to do our research at this time and then we're going to write our submissions at this time. It maybe ideally works out that way, but oftentimes it does not. Your research phase is just a chronic sort of phase that only really stops when you have your submissions kind of printed out and ready to go. And it also looked like taking notes and revisiting confusions or disagreements that we had.
Yeah, to clarify, the reason why so many questions would arise, and I'm hoping that for the mooters in the room who are thinking about how to apply this, I'm hoping you've made the connection, but it's because oftentimes judges will say something with authority, but they won't cite the authority. Let me rephrase. They'll say something, you believe it because they're judges, but they don't actually cite anything. So if you were to be asked about why something that they said is true, you would have to do your own independent research to understand why what they said is true. Obviously, common law is discursive, so they know that in the body of our common law, what they're saying is textually founded, but in a moot, you have to prove that you know it. So that's the type of thing where we'd say, okay, why are they saying this? Where is it coming from? How do we indicate to the bench that we understand, not just that this exists, but why it exists and from whence it existed?
Mhm. And to add on to that as well, we learned, I guess, when you moot, you just have to appreciate semantic differences. You have to appreciate what term to use and why you're using it. Um, I used to use language very imprecisely before I started mooting. And well, not really before I started mooting. I think up until like a year into me starting mooting, I still uh, used terms that had legal meanings in somewhat of an imprecise manner. And it really drags you down, especially if you get a question from any judge, honestly, who, of course, a legal professional or a judge in any moot cares about precision. Um, so it's important to know what you're saying. It's important to have a purpose when you've searched your or racked your brain on why you're choosing certain words, because the law really does appreciate the finer details. For me, that took a year to kind of come to fruition for. So it can, however long it takes for you, you will get there.
Yeah, but you must be very much trying to get there. I think that a lot of the ways I hear people discuss cases at moot competitions, for example, between rounds, indicates to me that for a lot of people, they're okay with just sort of being able to regurgitate what a judge said, but it doesn't go much deeper than that. And I think that's what differentiates people who make it to day two and people who don't, people who go on to win larger competitions, people who don't. That's ambition. That's like an internal ambition to really understand. So that's the number one piece of advice that we'd give to y'all. But that's just phase one. So let's move on to phase two, strategizing. So you do this once you know what you know and what you don't know. For us, that came 1 week before a U of T Cup and the week of Osgood. Ideally, it should come earlier for you. Neha and I were drawing on years of, well, year for her because she's just like a prodigy, but for me, years of mooting experience. And so we knew that we could pull it off, but you have to pace yourself such that you'll have enough time to be able to memorize your submissions and scrimmage to whatever capacity you feel that you must. Um, the way that we went about strategizing and specifically strategizing in terms of what submissions we would present, what arguments we would present, is that we looked at the legal issues in each of the respective case packages and then dissected them into premises and subclaims during our phase one. That sort of guided the questions that we had. What I mean by that is that if a legal issue was this is just random, but for example, I don't even know what case you guys are litigating, so this is very much random. But if it was the evidence should be excluded under Section 24(2), then there are subclaims that need to be shown in order to get to that conclusion. We broke it down to the finest subclaim that we could, because once you have all of them laid out, you can figure out what pathways you can take, argumentation pathways. That's us strategizing on how to prove each premise subclaim. And then at the end of it, once we have actually found all the different pathways, just go back for a second. Once we actually find all the different pathways, that's when we decide what pathway to take. Okay, now next slide. This is an inside scoop. It's a screenshot from one of our competitions, and oh, this would have been U of T Cup. This is not a submission. This is the document where we were attempting to map out the different premises and subclaims that we would have to build up. This is an outline, basically. It's quite detailed, mostly because we were very confused about how to go about the respondent argument in a way that made intuitive sense to us, which of course is ironic because that's the side we ultimately won the championship round with, which is to show that this process, this amount of depth of precision and details can really pay off in the end. So you can see here, we had an argument, for example, arrest powers are nullified based on the CDSA's purpose. Then we felt that we had to show the two premises in particular, what the CDSA prioritizes, and then how it prioritizes it. And then we got to a conclusion through that, and we were adding things underneath each premise as we were discussing. This was all made synchronously while we were on call. I can go. So
You go.
now, in this process, you will likely identify claims or argumentation pathways that you feel are unconvincing. In fact, those pathways may be what the judges at the Supreme Court level did. Don't freak out about that. Don't settle there either. I don't want to see anyone arguing what a judge argued just because a judge argued it, but you don't actually believe it and you see all the holes, because what's going to happen is you're going to be asked questions. You're going to give an answer, and everyone in the room is going to know that you don't believe it, because it shows. It shows when you don't actually believe what you're saying. And so this is where creativity comes into play. You have to find a way around the fact that you are not convinced by a particular pathway, but your way around it must be real and legally tenable as well. So that's where all of the understanding phase comes into play. Would you like to speak on an example of this, Neha?
Yeah, sure. So the example that we've provided is from Osgood Cup from this year. So if anyone competed in Osgood, the case we're talking about is Dorsey v. Canada, the Attorney General. If you recall, and I hope it doesn't stir back uncomfortable or bad negative memories to think about Dorsey, but you might recall one of the governing authorities of Dorsey, which was Dumas. And what the dissent was doing at the Supreme Court's level was arguing that Dumas was instructive, and on a straightforward application of Dumas, um, the the appeal would be settled in a way that was not helpful at all for the respondent. So Anna Sophia and I were very vexed by how to deal with Dumas on respondent. So we ultimately thought we needed to take a new approach, which was to claim that the relevant part of Dumas, a particular paragraph of the decision where a certain line had been said, that the dissent was taking that line and saying that judgment ought to be X. We said that that relevant part of the decision had to have been attenuated. We were able to do this because we had Kirkpatrick in mind. It's one of the governing authorities on overturning or a change in the law. And we had Kirkpatrick in mind because of previous moots. This is actually Anna Sophia had mooted a case where Kirkpatrick, I think, was one of the governing authorities in that particular moot. So having that knowledge as well, we were able to pull on that because one of the factums of the BC Civil Liberties Association cited Kirkpatrick, allowing us to base our argument on Kirkpatrick because the factum for Osgood was within scope of citations for the moot. That helped us develop a convincing as well as real and legally tenable argument that we could feel confident we're not kind of skirting around Dumas, we're not being legally imprecise. Rather, we're doing what's most legally tenable for what the respondent has to argue, and it seemed to us to be the most convincing way to get there. And it also just happened to be a more creative way to get there, which was something we were ultimately pretty proud of being able to bring to life. Anything to add, Anna Sophia?
No, no. What I will say, I lied. Yes. What I will say is that in terms of Kirkpatrick sort of floating around in my mind, I know that I must have learned that from previous mood. I could not tell anyone here what mood that was, but I say that to emphasize that, take comfort in the fact that as you do each mood, you genuinely are expanding the repository of information with respect to the law, and that will pay off in future moods, but don't leave it, how we all kind of maybe do an exam and then forget the content. Endeavor to remember, endeavor to internalize. And again, it's all connected. The phase one understanding, that level of depth that Neha and I engaged in, that's also why the information I've learned in past moots or Neha's learned in past moots lingers in our mind, because there are just hours of memories of talking about it that our brain has to pull from it whenever we next have to use this information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you'll also find, even if you're not citing an authority from a previous moot, there are certain keywords in each moot that you come across that are very indicative of a particular legal issue. And sometimes you will get a bench that will dish you a hypothetical, and it's in instances like that where you are forced to be creative, where you're forced to think outside of the scope of the legal issue at hand, which often comes around in questions, that you're able to really flex that muscle. You're able to lean on what you've read before. And those keywords really add to your credibility, and they also bolster the fact that your argument truly is legally tenable, because the words that you're saying, they're not simply kind of policy claims. They're not an ethos type claim. They're a claim that is using a language that the law recognizes, and the bench will recognize it as well. So now we'll go on. Actually,
Oh, just one more point.
Yeah.
Just teeny tiny thing. Another thing I really advocate for, and there are different ways to go about it, but I really advocate for it, so I'm gonna say it because you gave me the stage, is that you should outline the full argument that you're going to present, your full submission first, without anything in your mind about what part do I want to do, what part should my partner do. You should have the full flow together. And then after you and your partner have both agreed, okay, this is the flow of our argument. By the way, this is from Osgood Cup, if you couldn't tell by the handy little title at the left-hand corner. After you've done that, then you split it up. And the reasons why you might do a particular argument versus your your partner does a particular argument, that's variable based on who you folks are. But my preference has always been to do a flip. So first speaker one side, second speaker other side. And the reason why I appreciate that approach is because it makes sure that you both really know what you're talking about on both sides. So that's just a little tip.
Yeah, so as you can see, like as Anna Sophia said, so we've got on the left side of the screen, this was our skeleton. As you can see, it's also not as premise conclusion coded as our U of T cup outline was.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's the nature of the case, but also
The
we,
U of T Cup respondent outlines detail came from us genuinely being very confused, concerned, and needing to convince ourselves into the argument. That's the only reason it was so in depth. Whereas here, there was more of a shared understanding about what we would do. It was clearer to us.
yeah, it's consistently the case that the more confused we are, the more in depth we research because
Mhm.
we don't want to present an argument that we are not convinced by, and also that we know we will, as a result, not be able to convince anyone else of. So, like, for example, run-of-the-mill argumentation, that's not fully fleshed out at all, but we just left it there because we trusted that based on what we've read, we will be able to expand on that idea. And obviously, this is a skeleton, it's not our true submissions. But what this slide is meant to illustrate is that on the left-hand side, you've got our kind of our skeleton, the points that we do eventually want to plug into our submissions. And then on the right side, we did a speaker split and then we realigned our bullet points. And based on timing, but also I think, yeah, no, based on time, that's how we divided. We thought, how can we evenly touch base on arguments so that we're each meeting our like 7 or 8 minute time limit. We're not going over, we're not overburdening ourselves with too many issues that we can't fully explain. No?
And also something that just comes to mind, and we are being so slow with this, but something else that comes to mind is that I'm just looking at my fourth bullet point, the one that fell underneath my side of the skeleton, and I'm seeing the two bullets underneath that fourth line, and I can see that just from memory, that's not what I ended up arguing. If that happens, that's okay because you might be, starting to draft something, starting to actually flesh it out more in depth after you've done all this process. And you might come up with better arguments. You might realize that some things need to be more responsive and that allow yourself to have that freedom as well. But it's really important if that happens that you are in a constant dialogue with your partner because again, what Neha and I wanted to avoid more than anything is that we contradict each other or we don't understand each other's arguments.
Yeah.
Okay, this phase three with incredible speed. Basically, the three components of a skeleton of a submission: introduction, engagement with issues, conclusion. Intro, conclusion. There are always things about that on the rubric for a mooting competition. It's very easy points. Make sure you hit all of it. It's only going to be about 1.5 minutes, ideally less if you can. And then really everything else is your engagement with issues.
So we'll go through the introduction and the conclusion then because, they're, again, as Anna Sophia said, they're rubric items. They're things you do just want to get out because you know that a judge is looking for them. And they are also procedural in a way. But there's a formula to them that you can customize for any mood. So your intro, you start with your greetings, so your name, and who your client is, who you're representing. Um, then you want to have a hook or a policy concern or a theme that you're kind of opening your argument with. It's a sort of thematic way to introduce to the court or to your justices that, okay, this is why I'm coming before you. This is why our argument matters. And then you got your roadmap, so you're going to basically have a concise summary of the arguments that you're intent on making to the court in as simple language as possible so that the judge can truly grasp what you're going to say and not go into so much detail that you're going to duplicate any of the arguments that you're later going to make, which will be much more substantial. And then you're going to ask for your requested relief. As for your conclusion, similar in terms of its formula, you have your conclusion, which is basically a summary of the arguments that you've presented, but also including what you've asked for and what the outcome of those kind of sub-arguments and conclusions have been. And then your requested relief. Then you'll
Now,
end with a call back to your hook and your policy theme.
yes. A quick thing about the roadmap/conclusion argument summary. a great piece of advice I received from a judge whose name I just can't remember, but his first name is David. I think his last name starts with an H. If anyone knows who I'm talking about, put his name in the chat. I want to give credit. He instilled in me when I was younger that in a roadmap, even at the beginning, it is ideal if you can go beyond just sort of yes, hep install. Thank you so much, Cass. It's ideal if you don't just say sort of, the legal issue, but formatted to your side. It's ideal if you do give a brief explanation of what your actual argument will be. So, for example, if it's a 24-2 argument, you might say your statement, it should be excluded under 24-2 because severe impact, serious oversight. That's what I have here in my conclusion. It is ideal even at the beginning, I think. And also to emphasize, the hook policy theme thing, it shouldn't come off as kitschy. Um, Even my UFT Cup one to me felt just a teensy bit kitschy, but it's about delivery of it and whether it actually adds something to your argument. Really, the crux of our policy arguments had been that we need to address the drug epidemic by helping drug users and not disincentivizing them from calling for help. And so my closing line, which Justice Kirkisanis did compliment us on, was that when they ask the state for help, they'll receive help, not handcuffs. And that was, I would call that probative, as in it actually had to do with their argument. Avoid giving us sort of just throwing a line in there that doesn't really have anything to do with what you're arguing and which perhaps is peripheral to the actual case. Make sure that it's actually connected to what you're going to say.
Okay. Now, the bulk of your submissions, which is what you're truly going to be engaging with. I'll let Anna Sophia, you take this slide.
It's sort of the same logic as when you're writing an essay. Say what you're going to do it, say that you did it. Here we formatted it like state your conclusion or claim, defend your conclusion or claim, and then restate your conclusion or claim at the end. Now that's pretty broad. The reason it's broad is because the way that you can go about defending a conclusion or a subclaim, for example, is variable. You might highlight specific facts of the case, or you might use excerpts from case law, factums, or other authorities. Sometimes it's scholarly texts, depending on the case. And you might present a policy argument, which is often more of an intuitive sort of thing that you're presenting to the court. But again, the optimal way to structure it is completely context dependent. So we're just going to show you quickly what some of these methods may look like.
Mm-hmm. So we'll start with something that's more case law forward. The anatomy of an argument of this nature has three parts. So we've got the heading of our subargument, which you can see is underlined in green. We would say these subarguments not as they're written, of course. They would end up being something, if not ad-libbed, like some sort of extemporaneous kind of heading that we would give to indicate to the court that, okay, we're going to talk about this subargument. Then, given that this is a case law forward argument, we want to substantially engage with the case law in a way that we think will provide the answer to the subargument. So this is Osgood. Two different examples, two different issues, but at the top, we've got a floodgates, not a drought. The theme is more of a policy kind of idea, but the way it manifests is in a number of citations. So
it's a rebuttal. That was a rebuttal submission for me. So my segue was oftentimes you asked our friends about this concern or our friends articulated this concern, and then I'd say my line, but it's not floodgates, but a drought of justice, which is true. And I shouldn't bring levity to it, but that's what I would segue with.
And so given the nature of the argument, given that it is so citation heavy, you do want to have, as you can see, like the case and your paragraph numbers ready so you can show them to a judge if they ever ask you for them. And then you want to, at some point, either at the beginning, as in the first example, or at the end, as in the second example, you have a substantial or a tangible answer to the subargument. It can either begin the submission or end it, but that is the kind of relief that you're asking for, responsive to the subargument that you've brought up. So the way in which you use a case law forward argument is when you are convinced, or you're trying to convince the judge that the case law answers this question already, and all you need to do is lay out the citations for the judge for them to be able to put A and B together and see that, okay, well, the answer ought to be X. Anything to add, Anna Sophia?
Well, I guess something that comes to mind, I really don't remember who this judge was. I think it was UFT Cup 2 years ago. But something that I was complimented on was that every time, actually a few times I've received this compliment. Every time that a judge thought to ask a question, my next line was the answer. So if we're thinking about how to actually flow through your submission, perhaps that is an ideal way to go about it. There's a natural order to things in terms of like, okay, but if you say this, then what about this? You probably should say the next line. If you see that a question will arise there, make that next line the answer to the question.
Yeah, and that's even illustrated in two different ways in each of these examples. So at the top, the way that this argument manifested, as Anna Sophia said, it was a rebuttal, but it was a rebuttal of many parts. So each of the bullets was like a separate point. So the first, like lacks impartiality, no remedies, that was a point. And then so there was like a whole string of issues that Anna Sophia was going to be bringing up in that whole submission, and it had an ultimate conclusion, i.e., the internal grievance procedure is inadequate. The second example, we start with, well, we're working with a framework here, and then we have a question. Can unlawfulness be demonstrated with the refusal of security reclassification? And then we've got citations in a stepwise manner to answer a question. And then it leads inevitably towards a certain conclusion. That, of course, is an argument.
And well, you only get one example, folks. We're not sure what happened to the other one, but this is just more policy forward. The one that we see is from my submission, again from Osgood, and it was also a rebuttal. This was respondents, so much of my submissions were based on potential rebuttals. Policy forward engagement. So this is responding to major concerns the bench might have and working in potential questions. So the structure of this is, again, you say what you're going to do. And if you're addressing a concern, you're going to acknowledge the concern. So you say that by saying, we acknowledge this, but, and then rebut the concern. But you have to make sure that you have split up the way that you're going about rebutting this or assuaging the concern into each constituent part, as small and micro as you can. That's where clarity comes from. Okay, I think at this point, if we have any time for questions at all, we'd be happy to answer any questions, but it's just the next slide. Oh, also it was here, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to bring that point up, I guess it's like
it was just another example. If anyone has questions, we can take questions from y'all.
So maybe I'll build right on that last point there, and then hopefully there's questions that will come up. But how do you, I guess from the respondent side, you have the advantage of hearing the appellant's points. So how do you structure, and I was literally just judging like an hour and a half before this started, that how do you build that into your structure? What may be said, and then kind of use it if it is there from the respondent perspective, and then obviously from the appellant perspective, how do we kind of cut off an argument that could be made by the respondent so they can't raise that argument after we've rebutted it, pre-rebutted it, because it kind of looks undermined to then go and say the same thing.
Yeah. Go ahead, Neha.
I think that comes from when you, at your first, I guess even at your second phase, the kind of the ideation phase, you generally should have an understanding of what the appellant and the respondent might say for two reasons. You are drafting arguments for both sides, so you know what you're arguing, but also with your research, the goal is that you have conceptually understood what is the difference between the appellant and the respondent, i.e., where are the key sources of disagreement and what are the core concerns that I'm really grappling at when I'm leaning to the appellant or when I'm leaning to the respondent. So in that same vein, what your job as counsel is to do is to not only bring forth your own argument as to why, for example, you think the respondent's position should win out, the nature of respondent is being responsive. You're responding to an existing argument that has already been put to the court. So you have presumably already embedded an answer, a direct response that to what the appellant has already said. Even being the nature of the fact that you are supposed to directly respond to the concerns of the bench, and their concerns are likely going to align with the appellant. But the policy forward kind of structuring of an argument is a way for you to anticipate a question before it comes. Because as Anna Sophia said, like with the first example, if anyone remembers Dorsey, there was inevitably a question of systematic racism or systemic racism and how to address it. So the way that we went about it was embedding it right into our argument because we knew that concern was going to come. The minute the question came, we would jump right to that submission and then go on with the rest of our submission. So it didn't eat up unplanned time.
Yeah, so to synthesize that, perhaps, if the submission that you've prepared isn't already shutting down the major concerns that are going to come up on the respondent submissions, if you're the appellant, your submission is not thorough enough, and you need to go back to the drawing board. You should not be showing up surprised that anything happened or like, oh, I wish I had a rebuttal. No, your time is your time, and what you prepare should be good enough to already be addressing those things. However, to speak as to the mechanics, and if anyone's curious about exactly what Neha and I would be doing, it's kind of intuitive. It's just margins, really listening for the questions. I love to quote a judge to them. You know, it tickles me, it tickles them. It's a fun little moment of it's a fun dynamic when you're up there mooting. So writing down the actual questions. And oftentimes as the respondent, I find myself reorganizing my submissions as I'm listening to the appellant just to deal with the most major concerns first. So giving yourself the confidence, make sure you have the confidence to trust yourself to do that, and then giving yourself the space to do that as well is super important.
Yeah, and that I will also say that comes with it comes with time. When I first started mooting, I was very uncomfortable with changing anything that I had written. It was as if the piece of paper I printed is now concrete, and I cannot change the order. I can't change the words. But one of the I guess vices when you originally start mooting, but one of the wonderful things about mood is that mood is truly a conversation. At its peak, it is a conversation. So you should aspire, not fear of moot becoming a conversation, which inevitably requires for you to be adaptive. For example, day one, Osgood, our first round as appellant, we got feedback that our appellant submissions didn't make sense. So in our half an hour lunch break, we completely reorganized and reworked our appellant. That took trust.
This, by the way, is why we recommend that you are able to move on from phase one to phase two earlier than we are, because we were using day one as testing grounds for us. And we had the confidence that we'd be able to do that, just relying on the other places that we knew we'd get points. It very much gamifying mooting for us. But in general, you should be working all that out in scrimmages before day one.
Yeah, completely agree.
I guess last question here is about where you can concede points in terms of crafting your submissions going into the mood, or maybe pivoting during day one to day two. I've seen it very effectively done in some moots. Actually, shout outs to Cassandra and Anthony there. I think they did it to one of the moots I was organizing. But where does that come up from on either the appellant or respondent side? Do you give consideration, or even just let's focus on this issue more so than some of the other issues?
Well, that's a great question, and it ties into the strategizing, the two steps we gave in terms of how to strategize, breaking down the legal issues into their most precise, tiny subclaims that would need to be addressed, and then figuring out how you would go about potentially proving each of those legal issues or subclaims. Within that process, you'll be able also to identify, and this is what I mean when I refer to pathways. You don't necessarily need to prove every single potential subclaim, but some of them must be proven if you're going to take a particular avenue. So you need to know clearly what path you have decided to take and everything else you can concede just by process of elimination. Oftentimes, those other things are things that other people will be arguing, but you've decided it doesn't matter because the way that your pathway is, it doesn't matter to your argument. So I think that type of strategizing process allows you to very clearly see what matters and what doesn't to your ultimate submissions.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And an example there could be like if you just think of like Grant. Let's say there was a discussion about Grant and how the impact of the breach on the rights of the accused, that can be severe or not. Let's say you're arguing that the evidence ought not to be excluded, but you're dealing with in a serious impact. It's one of two steps. Like you've got seriousness, impact, and then the state's defense. Let's say the impact is serious. Your concession would look like we acknowledge the seriousness. However, we concede impact. We're going to talk about seriousness and we're going to talk about the state's defense. So, what I mean to say when I cite Grant is that identify again the subclaims you need to prove. If there is a particularly muddy issue or you think this issue is definitely going this way, you don't need to make life more difficult for yourself. And you also want to be, again, legally accurate. Don't make an argument that you just simply need to rebut everything that the appellant says because you're the respondent. You can't agree with anything the appellant says. That's not true, and sometimes that's also not legally the correct answer or not legally and tenable. So know where you can concede, and conceding sometimes plays very well in your favor because judges will appreciate accuracy.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Neha and Anna Sophia, for sharing that. Lots of information and examples, and thanks again for taking the time. And all the best as you continue on. I don't know if you're continuing on, but I'm sure there's moots regardless in the future for your career. So all the best, and looking forward to maybe judging you again sometime in the future.
Well, in fact, I'm at the end of my rope with mooting. Loved it. I'm not going to be mooting anymore. I say that to segue into saying if anyone ever wants any advice, if anyone ever wants to see any of my documents, any of my prep sheets, anything at all, just reach out to me. I have no stake in the game anymore, but to help other people reap the benefits the way that I was able to, thanks to the generosity of people before me. This is my personal email. Feel free to reach out, and thank you, folks, for organizing this event.
Perfect.
And I'll also drop my email. Thanks
Yeah.
for organizing.
Yeah, or if you end up coaching, or maybe one day you go to law school and you're like, oh,
If someone wants me as a coach, I'm happy to coach. Yeah, for sure.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you both so
Okay,
much.
bye.
Thanks.
So we're a little behind, but I think I didn't get a lot of uptake on anyone wanting to do the live moot. So we're actually on time in that sense. And I want to turn it over to our next speaker, who was, among other accomplishments, the 2021 Osgood Cup champion and a number of distinguished oralist awards over the years. And I think mooted in law school, so you maybe have a little bit of perspective there. And I think you're almost called, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you so much, Avery, for joining, Avery McKinley, for joining us here today. And she's going to talk to you about the next piece, which is, as much as you can craft those submissions, well, it comes time to show up to the competition and deliver them and have that presence. So thank you so much, Avery.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm becoming a lawyer on Tuesday, which feels so crazy. 2021 feels so long ago. But yeah, it's really exciting. And I actually have to go to court on Monday, so this has been helpful for me as well, just thinking about how I'm going to structure my submissions for Monday. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about tone and pacing and professionalism, just like basically what you're doing when you're trying to connect with a judge. You already have most of your words and submissions planned out. Practicing tone, I find, can really make a difference for connecting with a judge, and especially in mooting competitions, the way that you carry yourself, the way that you say certain things, I think makes a big difference with scoring because, for one thing, it is good to answer questions effectively, and I think that is where a lot of the points go. but the way that you say it really distinguishes you from other moot teams. So what I did is I practiced my tone a lot. The first time that I looked into mooting and was starting out, I didn't really know what my style would end up be. I'm still like fine-tuning things too, and I'm still like looking at how lawyers talk in court and how people do moot court and how they carry themselves and how they like say certain points, how they make certain like inflections with certain sentences that they say just to make their points more persuasive. So tone is something that you can always adapt and change. What I would do is I would just practice in front of my partner, um, my like moot partner, just saying whatever my submissions were, and then she would say to me, "Okay, you said this really well. Like this actually like that like struck a chord with me emotionally almost." And I wasn't being like overly dramatic or anything, but yeah, I think just like actually getting the words out loud helps you kind of figure out how you're going to sound. And then when you're at the actual moot and your tone is coming across to the judges, you're not like, oh, like that came out kind of weird. Like for me, I would probably second guess myself a lot if I said something with like a tone that I didn't really recognize. So I think practicing your submissions and how you're actually going to sound saying things makes a really big difference in terms of confidence and also like feeling calm. I would also give my partner a lot of feedback too when she was talking because she actually struggled a little bit more with tone than me because she would get like certain, like pretty excited about certain points and then other points she wouldn't feel as sure about. And you want to sound like pretty confident and sure of yourself throughout your whole submission. That's something that I also definitely still work on. But yeah, but sometimes like I'd ask her a question and she'd have a response and I would say, no, like that's a good answer. You just got to say it like with more confidence. So she would kind of practice how she would say things to me and then I would be like, okay, like that's the one. That's how you want to say that if you get that question. And then I would see it play out in real time at the competitions. So really it just comes down to practice, figuring out your own style. I've noticed when judging a couple of moots that some students go kind of like monotone, either because they're reading or maybe they aren't just like sure about what they're saying, or they're nervous, which is totally valid. Public speaking, like it isn't for the weak. So yeah, so one of the things that I do to kind of combat being monotone is I just picture that I'm having a conversation. I think that helps because if you go to a coffee shop and you see people having conversations, it's like it rarely sounds monotone. So I feel like approaching your submissions like it's a conversation and you're just talking quite a bit more than the judges, I think that like really helps. And then it also like gives you this kind of impression that you're open and like there's the openness to questions. That was one of the compliments that my moot partner and I got. And I've also given to a lot of teams who just seem like they're having a conversation. It just shows that they're happy to be there. They're open-minded to questions and they're trying to get a point across to you too. Also, when I draft my submissions for court now and even back in undergrad and in law school, I imagine my own voice saying those words. So like some people have like a voice like in their head that's, like as they're thinking of something, some people have a dialogue, some people have to kind of like produce a dialogue almost because all of our brains work differently. But for me, I try to picture my voice saying the words that I'm writing down. So then as I'm creating it, I already know how it's going to come across. And then when I'm practicing, I'm like, okay, this is how I'm going to say that. So that's just something that you can develop over time. But yeah, but that was helpful for me too, especially going from deciding what your arguments are going to be to actually saying your arguments. I feel like the way that you might write an essay or an argument is different from how you would actually say it to someone. And it also allows you more flexibility to kind of pivot if you're picturing yourself saying things and then a judge cuts you off partway. One, you know what your argument is and you know what you're saying. And then two, you can actually put it back to them in a very organic way. Another point is I timed myself a lot for even like subparts of my submissions. So for my introduction, I knew that would be like 30 seconds, for example. If I was giving a background on a case, that would be 20 seconds. If I was setting out a legal test, that would be like max 1 minute. For, let's say my submission had like three parts to it, I would say, okay, a minute 30 for part one, a minute 30 for part two, 30 seconds for part three, because that's like maybe easier, or maybe the other way around. Maybe part one would be shorter. I think that just helped me feel comfortable for when I was getting questions, that I knew that I still had a lot of time like left in my submission, or if I was running low on time, I would be able to kind of like pivot and like quickly go to another point and then just like say that main point and then move on. And I think that actually plays a big role in your tone as well, because or if you're like talking like too fast or you start getting kind of panicked, like it shows. So yeah, I think over preparing is probably my biggest tip. Yeah, that's probably like the biggest thing for practicing like your tone and your pacing. Um, Also for practicing pacing, my undergrad moot partner and I, we would go on long walks and we would be like saying our submissions to each other and asking each other questions. I think it helped to actually be like physically moving, because that forced me to not talk too fast or too slow, like, and not get out of breath too while I was talking. That was like one thing that me and my moot partner really like had to work on, because in moot practices sometimes we'd have like a long-winded answer to something that we were being asked, and we would be like gasping for air at the end. So being able to like walk and talk, that kind of helped me figure out what my pacing was. It would be kind of like the level that I would be talking if I was on like a semi like moderate like hike. So like kind of slow, but also like not too slow, and trying not to get out of breath too. Also just like taking a breath before you say something, it goes a long way. The judges, like, I don't think they'll hold it against you. I never hold it against a student if, like, I ask them a, like, tough question and they're just like, and they like think, and then they say something. I don't think that impacts their pacing at all. I think it's completely fine. And I'd rather have a student take a moment to think about the answer before giving it out, rather than continuing talking and then partway through the answer, they're like, oh no, like I don't know what to say next, which like you can think your way out of that one too. But yeah, that's just another tip, like trying to use that time up front when you get a question, thinking, okay, this is what my answer is going to be, and then your pacing stays on point. Third point for professionalism, I think about attitudes with types of judges that you'll get and like the types of questions that you'll get when I think of professionalism. It's sometimes hard to kind of like keep a straight face during a moot, especially when you get a question that like you just did not see coming. So there's like three categories I would say that there are for questions. First category is a judge maybe hasn't like read the case super closely and they just need to know what's going on. They just need an explanation. Sometimes that question will be like, counsel, like, what really is the issue here? It'll be simple, or it'll be, can you explain what the test is? Like, just something very like general. And that's a good opportunity to rack up some points with that judge. So that's like one type where you're basically having a conversation with them back and you're just explaining it to them in like a very open-minded kind of way. And I find that they really appreciate that, because if you're able to give them like a brief contextual answer so that way they understand what's being said to them later on in the submission, that goes a long way. It also just shows that you know what you're talking about on like a more like human general level rather than like a high level. And then the second type of questions that you might get are like the very high level questions, which shows that the judge like read the case very closely, or maybe they were a justice on the actual case or a counsel on the case. So they know that case very well. And I think that's an opportunity to impress them and show that you really also read the case and understand it and you understand the points and you want to use that point as strategically as possible. So I think that's just another like great opportunity to get more points and kind of show professionalism by like meeting them on their level. So first, if you get like a general question from someone who hasn't really read the case that much, you kind of like meet them on their level and you say something more, not generally, but like something that you know they'll be able to digest. Versus if you get a high level question, like if one of the judges or justices are asking you, okay, well, counsel, paragraph 53 of this dissent said, and I quote, and they quote the case to you, that's when you can quote the case back to them. And then the third kind of question, which is like probably the most like this is the one that I struggle the most with staying professional with, are the questions that I call like they're basically trying to see if you will stand your ground. So these are the kinds of questions where a judge genuinely interrupts you just to throw you off your game. And personally, I try not to do that as like I get how it's fun and you can do it in practice, but at an actual competition, I care more about like giving the student an opportunity to show what they know. But some you will get some like lawyers and like moot judges who will come in and just be like, I don't buy that. Like I've had a few judges who have just interrupted me and been like, I disagree. And they said nothing else. Like they just unmuted because we did Zoom ones at that time. They're like, I disagree, counsel. And then they muted again. And it's like, where do you go from there? Like, what do you say after that? So a couple of things that I do is I try to like continue the conversation while still like not dismissing them. So I'm trying to think of an example. So at a moot tryout that I had in law school, there was this one lawyer who was like acting as one of the judges on the bench. And what did he say? It was like I was making a point, and then he just said like no, I don't think so. And then and I'm trying to think of what I said back. I know I continued somehow. I think I said something along the lines of Justice, the reason for this is, and I just like kept going, and then he interrupted me again and was like, I don't buy that. And then that's when I got like almost a little like snappy at him back, and I was just like, Justice, even if you don't buy that, there's this other point, and I took them to another point in the case. So that's like a partial, like not a concession, but you're saying, okay, like we're not going to agree on this. That's fine. I'm still going to convince you on my other point. And I think he was impressed that like I showed professionalism. Maybe I could have said something a little nicer, a little more professional, but also you just have to own your own style once you have it. Um, Another thing that I've said to judges, if I get a question that I think is like borderline offensive, which I hope you guys don't get questions like that, but in my day, like I would get a couple. Sometimes like in just moot practices, because I think they were just trying to rattle me and see if I could like hold it together. I like to use like respectfully no, which like you have to use that sparingly and like use your judgment on that. I did not use that a lot, but like sometimes if a judge is saying something that's just like flat out wrong and they're like very convinced, but you've read the case and you know that like that's not your position, that might not even be something that was written in the case. They might be pulling that from something unrelated. You have a chance to correct them and like put them on the right course. And you can say respectfully no, and then give your answer. And also, when a judge asks you a question, it's always a good thing. If you get one of these three categories, it's a good thing. It's an opportunity for points either way, no matter what kind of question you get. In terms of professionalism, another thing is just appearing like a team. One thing that me and my partner did is we coordinated outfits and like, yeah, like we just talked about it. We planned things out. I think for Lions Cup, we wore like blue shirts and then like black blazers, or like we coordinated something where it was like something was matching. And I to this day, I don't really know if it made a huge point difference. I personally think it did, but yeah, like I think it just helps like you look more like a team, and I've heard that that's something that moot judges like. Um, yeah, so that's just another like sort of like thing that you can just do to make yourself stand out a bit more. And yeah, the last point that I'll make is just own your style. Just really, there were definitely some judges that didn't love our team. Like there were some judges that were like, you guys are fantastic, great at answering questions, all the compliments and stuff. But there were some judges that were like, like you showed me too much attitude or you didn't show me enough attitude. And like at the end of the day, like you just have to do your best, do what you think comes across well, be observant, be open to feedback, but also use your own judgment because it's just like life. Like not everyone is gonna love you or like you, and you just have to own it and like do the best that you can and feel good about it too. So I'm open to any questions if anyone has questions.
All right, I guess I'm always up first here. What about? I know you were talking about being over prepared, right? And I think one mistake sometimes I see quite a lot is you've prepared these great arguments, and whether it's a question, whether it's something brought up by the appellants and you're the respondent, something, or maybe the first round people didn't like that point, but how do you kind of naturally deliver? Um, because when you're confident in what you know, when you're saying you've practiced it, it sounds, and you were alluding to your own partner where, there's like ups and downs, ebbs and flows, but how do you kind of keep that level of conviction if you're not sure in terms of your delivery?
I usually first I think before I try to think before I talk. So first I take a moment and then I almost like I just take a breath and I say okay, like and what's happening in my head in that moment is I'm digesting the question and I'm thinking okay, they asked me this, what do I honestly think? Like just off the top of my head, like I try to take away the pressure of the fact that it's like a high like intensity like moot competition and they need an answer right away. Like I'm just thinking, okay, like they're genuinely asking me a question. What do I think about it? Why do I think that? And usually it'll lead me to something in a case, or it'll be like a kind of logical answer. And then that's when I say it back to them. And at that point, I think, okay, this is a reasonable thing to say back. So I try to deliver that same confidence back. So I think that kind of helps, like just taking that moment to think and then saying it with that confidence back. It's also a little bit of like fake it till you make it. Like at the end of the day, like moot court, the stakes in a way are low in some respects because it's not like a real case. Like it's based on a real case, but you're not the actual lawyer on it. Like, it's not your fault if you're not super convincing to the judge or if they're just like, oh, we like, we're like, they're not going to send someone to jail because you didn't do a good job in your moot court. So that was also a part that I thought about too, where I was like, okay, this is my opportunity to really say something with conviction, even if I'm not 100% sure it's right. So, like, I thought about it. It's a logical answer. It's the best I can do right now. And I've prepared so much that like I'm doing my best and I'm just gonna say it and see what happens next and try to move on from the question. So yeah, that's what I do. And I sometimes like even in court, like if I honestly have no idea what the answer is, I'm honest and I say, Your Honor, like honestly, I don't have an answer for you on that. However, I do want to make this point and then I go to another point. So that's another thing that you can do if you're really stuck and they ask you something that's like not relevant, you could say, Your Honor, that's not entirely relevant. The relevance is, and then you can bring them back into what you're trying to say. So yeah, I would try to like also consider how relevant the question is to the issue. That can also kind of help you figure out where you're gonna go. Does that answer your question?
Well, that's how you would probably end your question response in a moot, right? Did that address your question? It's actually really funny. I was judging earlier this morning. I said this a couple of times, and I exactly said "fake it till you make it" to the competitors about being confident, and so it's really reassuring to get the same bit of advice from a seasoned mooter as well. Um, so on that, I guess in terms of delivery, what about um, asking for that indulgence or kind of digesting the question, as you said? Is there a way to appropriately kind of compose yourself without sort of losing points and and answering a question or just delivering if you get kind of thrown off track to kind of regain your thought and moving on without just completely breaking down or something like that?
Yeah, so I think one thing that you can do is, okay, there's two things that I was kind of taught. One thing I don't fully agree with, but some people do and they love it, is they like drink a cup of water. But like for me, like as a judge, I would be like, okay, once you're done that like big gulp of water, can you answer my question? Which is like mean. I hope I wouldn't say that, but I'd be like tempted to like do that. But so that's like one thing that a lot of mooters have done, and they've been very successful and they've been okay. And like I've seen lawyers do it too, and they've also been okay. But I personally, I avoided that. I would rather just say to the judge, uh, Justice, if I could have a moment to confer with my notes. And then they're usually like, yeah, just a moment. And you're like, okay. And then you like try to find something. And then even then, if you're still kind of panicked and you still like and you just don't know the answer, you can just be like, Justice, that concerns outside of the scope of our submission, if it is outside of the scope. Or you could just say, Justice, I don't have an answer for you on that. However, I'd like to take you to this point. And then you just take them to another point. And usually they'll be like, okay, you didn't answer my question, but like you held it together and maybe there's something more important. So they might forget it, they might not, but yeah, I think that's kind of like worst case scenario if you have absolutely nothing to say and you're like, I genuinely don't know. Like, I think it's okay to just say like, I don't have an answer for you. Definitely try to avoid that though. Like I would try to exercise a couple of options before that. Like one, you could one, you could kind of rephrase their question that they're like giving you. So let's say you only understand like a part of their question. You could kind of just respond to that. Like I've done that before in like undergrad moot court or even in law school actually too, where a judge has asked me something like very long-winded and complicated, but there were a couple of trigger words where I was like, oh, I can tell them about that. I would just go straight to that point and it's turned out okay. Like they were usually like pretty happy. Sometimes they'll have a follow-up being like, no, I was like getting more at this, but they'll understand why you're answering that way because you're using the words in their question. So that's maybe like option one for like if you get like a question where you're like, I'm not really sure, but I do recognize some words. So I'm just gonna like go off of those words and start talking about that. And then option two is questioning the question almost. So if they ask a question that's just like not really like relevant at all, if you're able to explain why that concern isn't relevant to the case, I think that's fine too. You don't want to say like, Your Honor, that's not relevant at all. Like you don't want to say that, but you want to say, um, Justice, I understand your concern with this. However, that's not at issue before the court. Like, that's not at issue. And then you can explain, like, further, or you can just say, that's not at issue. What is at issue is, and then you redirect. So it's like you question the question, and then you redirect. So those are like the first, like, two things that I think about doing before going to, like, may I confer with my notes, or saying, Justice, I don't have an answer. However, I would like to take you to, and then, so yeah. So those are like a few tiers of options that you can deal with. And you can even have like a little like sticky note on like your binder, like kind of showing you, okay, like this is what you do when you get stuck. I used a lot of notes, so that felt like a safety net for me. Like even just having the paper there. Sometimes I wouldn't even look at my paper, but just knowing that I had something there in case I got into trouble, I could like look at it and be like, okay, now I can handle this. So, yeah.
So on that sticky notes, what about in terms of, in your advocacy? Because again, from to everything that's fresh in my mind is from what I just watched. Do you write out your whole submissions kind of almost word for word? Do you do points? Do you have a mix of things? Do you have what are some questions I'm anticipating, which will lead into our next speaker? But what do you do in terms of organization of that to better, I guess, speaking just to the advocacy component, right? Of how to deliver strongly. Do I want cue cards? I mean, whatever it is, how do you think you communicate, or maybe you've gotten feedback that says, great eye contact, great delivery, irrespective of, the content, but the sort of delivery pieces.
Yeah, so me and my moot partner, we had very like different styles to it, but basically, she would start out writing everything word for word and like memorizing it, but then she would memorize it so well that at the end, when we would get to the competition, she would have like basically like a napkin. Like she literally wrote it on a napkin once, and I was like, "What are you doing?" But and it was just like a little like mind map of points that only made sense to her. But like that's all she needed because she had a really good memory, so she was just able to do that. I do not have a strong memory like hers. So what I did is I had, I think, like 2 or 3 pages. I usually like do this for like court still, like 2 or 3 pages, sometimes even 1 page, where I just have like headings. Like I have things kind of like blocked off. So, okay, like here's my opening statement. And then it's just like a block of it. And then I usually like bold certain words that I want to emphasize. I usually have it memorized by the time I actually go up. So I'm making like full eye contact and I'm saying it, but like I have it there in case I kind of get flustered and like need to look down and say, okay, wait, what am I saying again? Because like for me, like I get nervous and it just helps to like have it there. So I do have like a full written introduction, but I have it in bullet points and it's like usually one sentence at a time. I don't really have like a big like block of text. So it'll be like introduction or like opening statement and then like 3 bullet points, like 3 sentences or whatever it is with like certain words bolded that I want to emphasize and I've practiced like emphasizing. And then I would have like my submission blocks. So then it would be like submission one, like that's what it would say in like all capital letters, like at the top in like big font. And then it would have like subheadings and then usually bullet points. Sometimes I would expand on those bullet points, like just based on how I'm feeling, or if I'm looking at the judge and they kind of seem like they want like an example or me to say a little bit more, that I just kind of improvise based on what I know about the case. So, and then the improv of that usually comes from practicing my submissions. So, like, it's not written down, but I'm just like having a conversation about the case with my moot partner. Eventually, that'll come out later when I'm actually doing my submission sometimes. So, that keeps me like a little bit off script. And then the other thing that I have is so like with those like blocks like here and here on the side of the page, I have in red like bolded italic font questions that I think might come up. So I think, okay, as I'm saying this, this might trigger these kinds of questions. Like, and I might get interrupted with like these kinds of things in my introduction. So I have those at the sides where it's like potential questions, and then I have like 2 bullet point answers, and it's not fully written, but it's enough for me to know what the answer is. So, and then sometimes when I'm having a hard time in practice, like delivering that answer or making it come across well, then I'll fully write it out and then I'll like practice saying it. So, like that's kind of what I do. And then I have that like just throughout my whole submission. And then also as I'm doing my submission, sometimes you get thrown into a different part. Like sometimes they're like, like I understand you have a whole submission on this, but I actually want to hear like part three of like what you're going to talk about. Because at that point, like you've done your roadmap. So then they kind of know what your whole submission structure looks like. So like, actually, can you go to this last point? I have some questions about that. Then you can like flip the page, you have your submission there, and you can just go like right into it, and it's like very clear. And then as you practice, that'll kind of stay in your mind too. So then slowly you might get like kind of off script. I recommend having like the opening and closing parts completely memorized, and you want to practice your delivery on that. I think a really good closing submission, like, or sorry, the closing part of your submission, that can be really impactful. Sometimes even if you have like kind of a rough question period and you like barely kind of make it through your submission, if you have a really strong closing statement, the judges like sometimes they actually kind of forget that you struggled a bit with the questions because they're like, "Oh wow, like that was a really good point. Like I am a bit convinced." So that was just a little side note there. So yeah, that's kind of how I structure it. My partner Rebecca, she would also like do flashcards to help her memorize. So that was her. And yeah, we're very different, but we made it work. So yeah.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Avery, for taking the time and joining us here today. I think it's now afternoon out there in BC. Congratulations again on your upcoming. Are you doing the call on Tuesday? Is that like at the I can't remember the Law Society building because actually I got or is that all done? And it's just actually then you get to be the signing of the roles and all that.
It's like so we did our signing and stuff yesterday. It's like it's kind of weird now because there's like a whole application process and like you do a bunch of oaths at different times now and you like send it into the Law Society. But the ceremony's on June 5th, but like my last like day as an articling student is like I guess Monday.
There you
So
go.
yeah, and then you just like become a lawyer and you're just at work and you're a lawyer. So
Yeah.
it's kind of funny, but yeah.
I think I was I was did something in the morning and then or there was like some work to do and then I had the ceremony and then in the afternoon I was like, oh well, you're a lawyer, come back to the office if you want to and get to work. But congratulations again, thank you for sharing all of that in terms of the advocacy and courtroom presence. And for everyone, we'll take a short pause there till 3:15 and we'll be joined by Michaela Mifsud, who's going to talk about anticipating questions from the bench.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again. All the best. All right, good afternoon again. And as we continue into our last session, which is on anticipating questions from the bench, I'm really proud to introduce another Osgood Cup champion and a number of other awards, distinguished advocates, winners, and various other moots. But and I believe also the Lions Cup, which you can correct me, of the year, but the 2025 Osgood Cup champion, Michaela Mifsud. And thank you so much for joining us. And you are on for anticipating questions from the bench. And I think one of the areas that often trips up, even the most seasoned of mooters, because suddenly you get Justice Rochester, as we know him here, with something that you weren't expecting, and then you're completely thrown off track. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. I'm happy to be here. So hi, my name is Michaela. I started mooting. Sorry, you can see my cat in the background. But I started mooting in my second year. Um, Actually, can you just give me a second? I think my cat wants to be let out. Sorry.
No worries. And as well for anyone here or anyone maybe listening to this recording, one of the things that we were hoping to do and kind of worked out conveniently that we had a lot of extra knowledge shared is an opportunity for anyone who gets their preparation critiqued by Justin and myself. So if any of you want that still, let's send us a message or an email and we can try to schedule a time to do that in advance of the Lions Cup or again, if you've done a recent mood and just want kind of some feedback, we're happy to share that with you.
Okay, sorry about that. So I started saying my name is Michaela. I've been mooting for a few years now. I started mooting when I was in my second year at McMaster, and I participated in the Osgood Cup twice. I won it in 2025. I participated in the Lions Cup twice. I won it in again 2025, and I've done a bunch of other moots as well. So I've had like a decent amount of mooting experience. and I've done mock trial as well. I just finished up my undergrad at Mac, and I'll be heading to Osgood in the fall, which I'm really excited about. So I guess the way that I kind of wanted to do this was I would talk a little bit about what I do to prepare for anticipating questions from the bench. And then if anyone wants to jump in and ask questions, I'm more than happy to help. Because sometimes, as people are talking, you kind of think of some questions or you want to expand upon things a little bit more. So feel free to, I guess, act like a justice and then jump in with questions like throughout. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and we can also do a Q&A kind of at the end if that's something you guys are interested in. So I guess the biggest strategy for me for being prepared for questions from the bench is just coming prepared and really understanding the case. You don't have to understand every single aspect of the case, like and all of its intricacies and all of the intricacies of the cases that you're citing, but it's important that you know generally what you're talking about and what your partner is talking about. So if there is a small detail that's perhaps irrelevant kind of to the overall case, maybe you don't need to know that super, super well, but to know what you're talking about incredibly well and to understand what you're actually saying. Because it's one thing to just sort of reiterate talking points that you've read or that you've heard, perhaps if you've listened to the Supreme Court hearing. And then it's another thing to actually engage with what you're speaking about and to really understand it. So you want to refrain from just regurgitating points and actually understanding what you're talking about and really being able to engage with those ideas. So the best way is just through practice and through dialogue with a partner. So for me, with my partner Helen, we would like to sit down and we would talk about the case in a few different stages. So when we're first preparing, we would sit down, we talk about what we think about the case initially. We'd come back after a second, maybe third reading, and then we would talk about what we're going to do to divide submissions and stuff like that. So basically, when you're talking about the case and kind of the problems that come up, naturally questions will also arise, and that'll help you anticipate them. So if you're able to just discuss with your partner, I didn't really understand this, or what does the justice mean when they're saying this, et cetera, et cetera. That's quite helpful because chances are another justice that will be judging you might have thought something very similar. So that's just like one kind of thing I like to do. And then you kind of discuss the answer to those questions. And then that's kind of where the practice comes in. Once you have your submissions actually written and you have a lot of your material kind of gathered and in place, it's good to just like practice with your partner or with your team if you are mooting with like a team. Like I would moot with the McMaster team. So we'd all get together and you just do practice rounds. And I find that to be incredibly helpful because people will have slightly different submissions. Perhaps you'll touch on slightly different things or argue things in unique ways. So that's how you're able to kind of anticipate different questions for each other. And so I think that that collaboration and that teamwork is incredibly important. And that's kind of where the understanding of what you're talking about really comes into play. Because if you're actually understanding what you're saying and what you're talking about, then it makes answering questions a lot easier because it's one thing to, hear a question and regurgitate an answer, but then it's another thing to hear a question, think about what it's really asking you, and being able to answer it authentically based on what you know. So, for example, during the Osgood Cup, I was posed a question about because the case was regarding exigent circumstances. At least that was what I was talking about in section 24(2) of the charter and section 8 of the charter. So I remember I got a question that was about whether or not exigent circumstances are created because these drugs in question that were laced with fentanyl were in a motor vehicle. So he was kind of like he was driving with them, the accused. And so the question was, well, when we know these drugs are on the move, wouldn't that sort of make it exigent circumstances? And I kind of thought about the question for a bit, and I was like, well, I've read in this case, about how just because drugs are on the move or in a conveyance doesn't necessarily make it exigent circumstances, but rather it can exacerbate it. And so then you're kind of able to use your knowledge of those cases and what you understand from them to be able to answer the questions rather than just like regurgitating some other sort of answer. So I find that to be really helpful as well. And I think it also comes with like time. It's easier to anticipate questions once you've had that experience because you're able to kind of pick out, this is going to sound a little bit strange, but there's certain types of judges, and so they kind of ask different questions. So there's some that kind of ask questions that seem a little bit more adversarial, and so they might be hyperbolic in nature. So you can anticipate what kind of hyperbolic questions you might be thrown your way. There's others that ask questions that are really hypothetical, and they want to put you in a imagine, you're in a different situation with similar circumstances, and how might the principles apply there. And again, that's where understanding what you're talking about is really important. So you don't, just say something random that doesn't really make sense and you're actually giving a genuine answer. Yeah, and then there's other judges who are going to ask you questions that are super fact-based. They want to know about the facts. They want to know what you know about the facts. And there's others that kind of want to know your personal opinion. So it's kind of important to make sure that you're able to anticipate what the right answer is going to be and not give like a kind of silly personal answer, even if you want to, which is a mistake I've made before. But yeah, so once you've kind of had that experience and you've learned about the different sort of like types of questions that are thrown your way. Once you're actually reading a case or you've done your submissions, it's easier to anticipate where a question might be. And sometimes, when I'm doing my prep with Helen, like I know, oh, a question's going to come in this section. So sometimes I'll even pause because I know what kind of question will come, and where it's going to come. So if I'm gonna, I'm reading like, oh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, X, Y, Z. And then I'll take a pause because I know, yeah, I know a question's going to arise at that moment in my submissions. But that's something that really just comes with time and practice, and doing it a bunch of times. So the more that you go to mooting competitions, the better you'll be able to anticipate where those questions will come and then like what type of question it'll be. So I remember I did Hawks Cup, and this was 2024. And it was an employment, like an OSHA case basically. So like health and safety and employment law. And I remember we're all sitting down and we're all practicing at MAC. I think it was like in the student center or something. And I remember thinking to myself, 100% a judge is going to ask about whether or not this principle that applied to a work site, like owned by the city, would apply also to a like someone's home, like if you're doing renovations in your home. It would make more sense if you had mooted the case, but essentially, I was like, I have a feeling they're going to ask about like how is this going to apply if like, you're doing like a home reno, because it was about whether or not like it was about liability and owning the work site and stuff like that, to make a long case short. And so I think people will kind of take it back, like, why would you apply it to a home reno? Like, that seems kind of like out of pocket. And then, sure enough, the very first question that I was asked when I actually mooted it first round, first day, was the home reno question. But yeah, that's just something that kind of comes with time. And also, if you're doing that practice with your partner, if you're kind of going back and forth with the questions, and if you're sitting there trying to think about questions, eventually questions will arise. And so, yeah, it's just about kind of like that practice, that like forcing yourself to think outside of the box and think a little bit critically about what you're reading. And then obviously the questions will sort of naturally arise for you. And then kind of learning the different types of questions that can arise and stuff like that. And honestly, at the end of the day, you can't really anticipate every single question. You can anticipate like the types of questions you might get, where they might come into your submissions, and what the best answer might be. But some are just going to come out of left field, and you'll never be able to anticipate that, and that's just a fact that you have to sit with. I know that I think it was like I think I was either the Lions Cup or the Osgood Cup. I can't remember which one. Um, but I remember a judge threw at me a completely like crazy, like hyperbolic kind of question. I think we were dealing with drugs or something like that. And then she was like, "Well, what if it wasn't drugs? And what if it was like explicit material about children? And what if it was like myco-justice?" And I was like, well, you're throwing me kind of into like really weird hot water because I don't want to like say something because you've now like put your co-justice like into this hypothetical, and it makes it very strange. But you just have to like keep your composure and like kind of maybe even play into it a little bit. Like I like to throw in a joke like, oh, as we know, your co-justice would never say something like that and then answer the question, right? But something like that, you're never going to be able to anticipate because it's just going to come out of left field. Um, but yeah, I think it's just like a matter of like really knowing your submissions, practicing, talking about it with your partner or with your if you're have a team, like that's even better. And then just accepting the fact that yeah, I can anticipate, a certain number of questions or questions I think are likely to come up, but I won't be able to anticipate all of them, and that's okay. And sometimes that's fine too. Sometimes you need to take a second and sit with the question that you are given, and really just think about it. Because sometimes, I found that judges will ask really interesting and engaging questions that I hadn't thought about before, and they really make me think about, what am I actually arguing and that kind of thing. So, or really kind of rethink the position that I'm supposed to be representing. And I find those ones are honestly like a really great learning experience. And it's good when you answer them authentically, and don't pretend to know something that you don't know. Or if you're struggling to answer a question, I think it's really important that you say, Justice, may I have a moment's indulgence to check my notes. You go over your notes and see if you can piece together an answer if you're kind of unsure, or never be afraid to, if you're asked about a particular fact or a particular case or a particular factual matrix about a case that's not the one at bar, then don't be afraid to, like, again, ask for the indulgence to check your notes, and to actually get an accurate answer because, it's important that you actually provide an authentic and true answer rather than just kind of like rushing through it and going through the motions and giving inaccurate information or giving a disingenuous answer or an answer that is misleading or factually incorrect. Like that's the last thing you want. It's always better to say that you either don't have the answer or that you need a moment to check to make sure the information is correct. So I think those are like some of my biggest tips about anticipating questions from the bench. And I think that we have like a few minutes left. So if people want to do like ask questions or ask me to expand on something more, like I can definitely do that.
Yeah, so Michaela, in terms of maybe in terms of the preparation piece,
Mhm.
obviously having a partner, having a team, if there's multiple teams at a school or college or university, helps in that. But where do you kind of think of, well, what are the kinds of questions? As you gave up the example, I remember that case. I think it was Sudbury or something, uh,
Mhm.
at the Hawks Cup, where you're looking at liability, but where kind of you draw upon that, like, well, here's why I think they're going to ask this. Like, how do you kind of gain that insight, and how can you pass it along to anyone here who may be mooting for the first time, or getting into the Lions Cup for the first time,
Mhm.
or any moot thereafter, of how do you put all that together to be like, here's the kind of question that may be asked, especially even though most people, if not everybody, don't have much of a legal background at these stages in competitions.
Mhm. That's a good question. So I think that it's important to well, I think when you're first starting, it's going to be much harder for people to be able to anticipate questions to the same degree as when you have that experience. So that is something that just kind of comes with experience, not to like scare anyone away. It's important that you get that experience, but I think that it's some of it is intuitive. Some of it is like, okay, when I'm reading Sudbury, for example, and I'm thinking about, liability in a work site and stuff like that. I kind of think about sometimes your mind sort of naturally will think about other similar situations, right? So I think that's something to think about as well. What's a similar situation to what I'm reading right now, but with a little bit different circumstances, and how do these same sort of principles and legal concepts apply there, and how are they kind of related? And then you can kind of from there sort of form questions, and that's how I sort of thought about that renovation example that did ended up coming up exactly as I thought it would. I thought about what's a similar situation to the one that I'm reading right now, and how do those legal principles apply to that sort of like similar but different circumstances. And that's kind of how I like intuitively pick up on those sorts of questions. But yeah, it's just a matter of like thinking about different scenarios that might occur. Or if you've, read a bunch of case law, you kind of think about how those different scenarios are similar but also different, and then how do we kind of connect those through, precedent and that kind of thing.
Perfect. And I mean, most cases are Court of Appeal or Supreme Court of Canada decisions, do you find you had time to like watch those webcasts if they're available and look at kinds of questions that were asked there? And how often do you see the same kinds of questions? And I mean, you gave all these hypotheticals that came up that were
Mhm.
kind of a little obviously probably wouldn't have been asked at the Supreme Court. I can only imagine
Yeah.
that to being the case. But do you find that there is value in going through the questions that were asked there and the answers in the situations where the moots obviously are based on Supreme Court decisions?
Um, Sorry, I just see Justin's thing in the
That's the
corner. I'll
next question.
answer.
So you get a little bit of time to
Okay,
prepare for
perfect.
that.
Well, for in the spirit of mood, I'll answer your questions in two parts, if I may, justices. But I think to your question, about sorry, you'll have to remind me. Sorry, you have
Yeah.
to remind me your question. I got totally distracted.
I shook her up.
I
I
guess
shook her
I
up,
can't
Dave.
see them in two parts. Like, yeah, sorry.
The Supreme Court decisions that have
Oh, right, the hearings,
recordings,
yes.
and do you
Yeah,
find that one, it's value to
yeah.
go through them and prepare, or is there kind of a correlation between those questions and the questions that are actually asked at the competitions?
Yeah. So, historically, I like to listen to them as a podcast. I don't watch the webcast because I find that boring. But I will listen to it because there is a Spotify channel. If you look up Supreme Court of Canada on Spotify, you will find all of those hearings put into a podcast form, and that's like so good because then you can do other stuff while you're listening to it. I find them helpful to an extent and to a degree. I wouldn't base my whole submissions off of them, but sometimes if you think counsel makes a good point and then they have like the kind of case law to back it up that's also present in the case that you're reading or in the judge's decision, then I'm like, yeah, go for it. I think that's awesome to add that in, and I've done it before. I find that it comes in clutch like the most when you're answering a question and all of a sudden you remember something counsel said and you're like, oh wait, that kind of applies to like this question, and then you somehow like work it in. That's like I find when it comes in the most clutch. But you don't really have to. I think if you want, I think it's good to listen to once you have a solid understanding of the case. So once you've started writing your submissions, then I would listen to it because I think it's hard to follow unless you've done kind of your homework on it. I find. But it's not necessary homework. It's not, required reading, I don't think. But if you're like cooking and you like to listen to podcasts like I do, I think it's, no harm done. And sometimes, I'll keep a little notes app open while I'm listening and cooking or listening and walking to school or whatever. And if someone, a judge asks a really good question, I'll note it down. But I haven't found the questions to be super transferable. Like they won't ask the same questions. Sometimes they do, they'll ask questions that are similar just because they're quite basic. But not basic but they're kind of like fundamental questions, I guess is the better way to phrase it. Um, but I don't think it's you're not super losing out if you don't listen to it. But sometimes the questions can be similar, but sometimes like Justice Cote will ask something like that's so out of left field, and then no one ever replicates it. Or Justice Rowe sometimes does that too, and you're like, whoa, like what the hell? But yeah, so I recommend listening to it if you have the time or if you like listening to podcasts, but it's not like crazy required reading. But it can be a little bit helpful at times. And then to
Yeah, let's go to
um,
Justin's question, which
Justin's
we'll read
question.
out here. What advice do you have if you end up in front of a judge like Justice Rochester here, and for anyone who has never had a maybe tougher and wanting to get you off the sort of fundamental questions as you just framed it, to
Mhm.
kind of how do you apply the law in those situations?
Well, I've never found Justice Rochester to be, he's never been adversarial with me. I've always found him to ask very um, questions that get me thinking, but they never they never feel adversarial, which I really like. I think that they get me to think a little bit deeper and more in depth about the case, which I like. But um, I think that we're thinking, because thinking about kind of judges who sometimes will ask things in an adversarial manner. Sometimes it can be a little bit off-putting, and that's okay. But just kind of remember, like they're not asking you these hard questions, or they're not asking them in this manner if they think that you can't handle it. If you can't handle the questions, you're not going to get them. Like that's just straight up what it's going to be. If they're like, oh God, like Michaela's fumbling, like she fumbled that last question, they're going to lay off just for a second, right? And let you kind of like recoup. But if they're like peppering you with questions back and forth and back and forth, they don't think you're stupid. Quite the opposite. They think that you know what you're talking about and that you're able to handle it. Because it also is good at getting you off book. And that's like a big thing for mood, is like maintaining that kind of conversation, um, or yeah, that kind of conversation that you're having with the judges. So when they're asking all these questions, they like it when you're off book and you're actually kind of like drawing on the knowledge that you've retained rather than just like reading off of like a script. And it kind of, I think it prompts you to think a little bit more critically and answer in that more critical and genuine manner, which I think reflects very well on people. But yeah, I think the best thing to do is to remember that they're not actually trying to trip you up. It's because you can handle it. And like sometimes when judges are asking questions and they kind of sound like they're super confused, it's not because they're confused at what you're saying. They're confused about the case and they're actually seeking clarification and they actually want that dialogue with you. And I think that that's something that's really awesome about moot, is that like sometimes you'll have like legal experts who are like, I actually don't even really understand why that they like made this decision. And you might not fully understand either, but you're working together in this very kind of strange way to actually get to the bottom of it, or to get to the bottom of like why, this decision ended up this way, or how could it have been different, or how could it have been better, or that kind of thing. And that's something I really like about moot. But I think the most important thing or lesson I ever learned from moot was, or how to be good at mooting, is just remember, treat it like a conversation. Treat it like you're having a conversation with the justice rather than like I'm having a debate with the justice, or the justice is trying to throw me off, which like maybe sometimes they are. But you just got to like remember, I'm going to keep it like a conversation, and I'm going to keep answering these questions as if we're having a conversation, because oftentimes the judges are literally genuinely curious about what you're saying and they want to learn more. Like there's judges who are like, yeah, I just genuinely wanted to know, why was this your position? Or, how were you able to justify this position? And you were able to answer it, da 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 da. But, sometimes they're just like genuinely, or they've read the case and they're like fixated on this one issue because they're like, I need to know more. And, they're asking you these questions because you're genuinely going to help them, work through that and find that answer. So I think that's my answer.
All right, Michaela. So, kind of a two-part related to that is what happens when you get the opposite and there are no questions, usually in the first round. And then the other end of the spectrum, part two, kind of relating to that, is when you're being peppered with questions, right? So,
Mhm.
we looked at anticipating questions in terms of formalities, but, as you progress through the rounds, I think the fastest I've asked a question was like 13 seconds into the submissions,
Yeah.
and Justin's probably like, oh, I do it in 3 seconds, or whatever.
Yeah.
But the point is, how do you kind of adapt to whether you'll get one or no questions, typically at the beginning, or
Mhm.
and crafting, again, to build on what was said by our earlier speakers, crafting submissions, oral advocacy. How do you kind of weave all that together in terms of, because you don't know how often or how little you're going to be
Mhm.
asked, and you got to prepare 7, 10, 14, 15 minutes sometimes, depending on the rounds.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Justin, for that shout out in the comments. That was cool. But to answer your question, I think that the solution to um, that striking the balance between, am I going to be peppered with a lot of questions or will I have no questions, which is like kind of awkward, is like just have more material than you think you need. Just have more material than you like think you might need. Because some people make the mistake of they're like, well, if it's if like Osgood, for example, if it's a 7-minute submission, well, then I should have 6 minutes of a script because I have 1 minute prepared for questions. Well, never, ever, ever do that. Always have a little bit more than you think you need, but be able to cut down, like kind of I have like a short version and then I have like a long version sometimes. Not in that I have two scripts, but I have like, I have my main script, but then I have these additions if I need to kill time. And then I also know where in my submission I can skip or shorten it down to like one phrase, if I need to like be quick with it, if that makes sense. Because I think that, when you have those moments where you don't have a lot of questions, really the most important thing to do, because there are some judges who just like want to like hear you talk as if you're giving a speech, and they're not necessarily going to mark you lower for that. They just don't have a lot of questions, or they're new to mooting and they don't ask a lot of questions, like whatever. I think the best to do there is to focus on the advocacy and to focus on your speaking and your speaking skills. I think because I'm lucky, I'm always the second speaker. Never been the first speaker. Never want to be the first speaker. I am a second speaker till I die. But it's nice for me because I get the advantage of seeing whether or not my partner gets any questions or the other team gets any questions, and then I just kind of like can feel the vibe from there. But sometimes people aren't so lucky and they're the first speaker. But I think it's good to have in those moments where you're not getting that many questions, you just gotta like, really focus on like speaking slow, speaking clearly, um, and maintaining eye contact, even though it's a little bit awkward with the judges if they're not asking questions, and just focus on those sort of like rudimentary and fundamental aspects that make up like a good speaker and like a good public speaker. So just kind of like really focusing on like your tone and your speed and am I enunciating things correctly? Am I emphasizing what I need to be emphasizing and stuff like that? I think that's good, and like really taking it slow. And then those moments you can take your longer version of your submissions and like kind of add in stuff as you need. And then when you're being peppered with questions, if you have like a bunch of different material that covers a lot of stuff, you're able to have access to a wider variety of material, and then you can like answer a wider variety of questions. And I think that that's pretty helpful. And it's also good to have those short forms. Like I know that in the Osgood Cup, for example, I had three different versions of my 24-2 test because I was like, well, what if I have no questions? Then I do my long version. If I have like some questions, I do my medium version. And then at the like in the finals, for example, I had to do my like super short version, which like every single branch of the grand test got like one sentence. And that's how I kind of divided it. I basically just went like, and I kind of, this is so embarrassing, but I look back at the video and I'm like, I was in such a rush and I was so flustered from having done like 14 minutes of like nonstop questions that I literally didn't even say the names of the branches, which like don't do that. Make sure you kind of like allude to which branch it is. But yeah, so you just kind of have to have like, just be prepared. Again, it's like that preparedness that's important. Be prepared to like speak uninterrupted, and then be prepared to like totally have, your short version ready to go. But yeah, I think that's my answer.
Perfect. Is there any other questions from anybody? As I see Jen Loristani has joined us and ready to give her keynote there to close up. Jen, do you have a question? I feel like you're ready to pepper Michaela here with something.
Yeah, council. I'm not going to do that to Michaela today.
Yeah, I've had Jen a number of times on the bench, and it's always like rewarding, but never not a little bit scary.
But you always do great.
Thank you. I
There's
appreciate
a
that.
reason, right? You and
Yeah,
Helen have performed as well as you both have for a number of years now. So
thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah, it speaks volumes. Yeah,
I feel
thank
like
you.
Jen's meaner than me. I just got to say that. I just got to throw that out.
But we'll
I
find
think,
out. I will say though, I had like a first time Mooters and they had Jen. It was like an online one, and I'm like, oh, this is not the way to start. And they never came and mooted again. So
What?
no,
there's
Oh
sorry, don't do that.
no.
That's not, no. It's like
uh,
if Jen's asking you a bunch of questions, it's because she knows you can handle it, like I said before, and she's trying to like test your knowledge and get you, she knows what you're capable of, and she wants to get you to get to that like full capacity, if that makes sense.
And I think that's fair. Usually, like when I realize that they can't handle it, I tone it down a
Yeah, yeah.
lot. But if you can play the game, I want to play with you, right?
Exactly. Yep.
there
Yep.
we go. Well, thank you so much, Michaela. All
Yeah,
the best at
anytime.
Osgood. I'm sure
Thank you.
there's like the first year moot, if I remember, and many other opportunities to continue on. I think those are your trophies in the back there or something that looks like it.
Oh yeah, don't look at those.
So thanks again for joining us,
Yeah,
and
anytime.
we'll look forward to seeing what you accomplish in law school and beyond. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you for having me. It was great to talk to everybody. Yeah, so I guess I'll see you guys around. If you're ever at Osgood, I guess starting in August, like let me know if you want
Yeah,
some advice or
you're gonna
anything.
be
Want to hang out?
judging those competitions now.
Yeah, maybe I'll be there. I think I'm gonna judge. I think the plan is I want to judge the Osgood Cup, and I want to judge. I think if I don't do, I think Jonathan might kill me if I don't judge Hawks. So I might be there too.
There we go. Thank you again,
Yeah.
Michaela.
And maybe apply to be on the student committee with the Osgood
Potentially, I
Cup.
might do that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of have trauma from event planning, but I might do it.
It's fun and we need more students on board this year.
Okay, I feel like an obligation. I feel like I should. I'll do
You
it.
should,
And
yeah.
now it's recorded, so you can't back down. Jen's
I
gonna
can't back
full
down
time.
now. We have it in like on video. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me. Good luck to everyone if it's your first moot. Don't be super scared. Be prepared. And you'll do great. Okay. Bye, guys.
Thank you again.
Bye, Michaela.
All right, and our final speaker of the day, not to be outdone by all the other Osgood Cup champions. I believe it was 2016.
It's been a decade.
A decade of mooting excellence. You should have like a plaque, 10 years of I mean, in all veins though, right? I mean, it's not just as a competitor, obviously, as an organizer, a co-founder of the Lions Cup, and obviously coaching. I believe I believe Avery was coached by you at one point.
Avery was coached by me, a number at the McMaster team for a number of years. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, in all veins. So, turn it over to you, Jen, and as now a criminal, are you on the defense side now? I believe.
I'm in defense right now. Yeah, I keep going back and forth. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what I'm doing
but
anymore.
experience on the crown side as well. So very, very apt to kind of close up our Mooting 101. And thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, JP. I appreciate it. So yeah, hi everyone. I know it's probably been a bit of a day for everyone here, so I don't want to talk for too long, and I also want to leave an opportunity for anybody who has any like lingering questions, either from the previous speakers or just anything that I end up saying, just to ask those questions if you've got them. Um, so I think a common issue when it comes to mooting is that people try to sound very smart. I'm not sure if this has been touched on today at all, but they'll try to overcomplicate the issues using a lot of very big words, complicated words. Sometimes they don't necessarily fit in the in terms of what you're actually speaking about when you're mooting. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is trying to convince the judges uh, that your side is the right side. And a part of that means that you have to get the judges to trust you. And in order to do that is to really know your case and to know your facts. So first and foremost, when it comes to Canadian appellate advocacy, which is different from American appellate advocacy, especially on the competitive side of things, because the American competitions, it's very performative. It seems like theater. In Canadian appellate advocacy competitions, it's more about conversational persuasion. Um, the best advocates, both in court and in competitions, uh, have a very calm demeanor. Um, and it's people that present themselves to the bench as that you can trust them and that they want to be able to follow what you're saying. Um, Ultimately, the bottom line, especially at the competitions, it's not necessarily about who put on the best show on stage. Um, what it ultimately comes down to is who really understood the law and applied the facts correctly and and made me get it. Um, and in order to do that, there is a handful of, I guess, tricks to do that. If you speak too fast, judges are never going to be able to follow you. So it's really important to speak nice and slow. And sometimes when you're practicing, um, try to speak as slow as possible. It might seem very unnatural to you, but when it comes to the bench, they will very much appreciate that you are taking your time to explain things. Judges are writing things down. Um, and they're also thinking about uh, maybe perhaps some questions arising out of what you're saying, which, you want to give them the opportunity to be able to ask those questions so that you can guide them to the answer that you want them to arrive at. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the mistakes I see in mooting comes down to uh, mooters, unfortunately, trying to overcomplicate uh, their submissions by using really big words that don't necessarily fit. What you actually want to do is you want to simplify. At the end of the day, you don't know who your bench is. You don't know who your judge is necessarily. I know this is a criminal case, for example, if you have a judge who isn't particularly familiar with, especially with criminal law, um, you don't want to use complicated terms and words. You want to simplify it for them because ultimately, at the end of the day, you're trying to persuade them. So the easier you make their job, the better the chances that you're going to get higher scores. Um, so that's on the advocacy side of speaking when you're in a competition. Um, I'm sure you've heard a lot today about making sure you know your case law. I think I walked in at the tail end of Michaela talking about 24-2 and being, outlining each line of the grant inquiry and failing to do that. Um, Everybody obsesses over case law. I think I've done a handful of speeches emphasizing the importance of case law, but moots, actually, if you're going to do really well in a moot, the facts really matter. And a lot of the times when you hear in mooting, it's all about law, it's all about law, the facts don't matter. Well, the facts do matter. Um, if you know your record really well, and when I say record, I mean the trial decision. I know at the Lions Cup this year, they're doing something that hasn't really been done before by taking a trial decision and you're now appealing it to what would be technically the Court of Appeal for Ontario, but you get the point. Um, Knowing that record, the trial decision, knowing what the evidence was that came out, knowing what the findings of fact were by the trial judge. These are, the finding of facts are ultimately o deferens absent an overriding palpable error. So, um, it's really important that you understand your record and know it. High level mooters memorize key record sites. And when I say that, like the citations, you can directly take the judge to that specific paragraph to say, Justice, actually, you can find that at paragraph 16 of the trial decision where Justice so and so found XYZ. Um, it's really important to know your timelines really well if they're, in terms of the chronological order of the event or the incident that brought this individual before the court. Um, and really, ultimately, especially when and it goes both ways, both for the Crown and when you're representing the accused. Um, the facts really matter because they go directly to the core of your theory of the case. And I'm hoping this was touched on today because when I say theory of the case, what I mean is um, something to the effect of chief justices, this appeal is primarily about X. That's the theory of your case, and the facts are going to support that. And the law you're going to use to get the judges to agree with you and agree that the trial judge either got it right or the trial judge got it wrong. And here's why. Um, so in that when I make that point there, what you ultimately want is structure, and that comes out of like the roadmap and how you're going to set out your arguments. I'm sure that definitely was touched on today. You want to be very confident when you deliver that line, and it's sort of the hook that you're going to keep coming back to throughout your submissions. Like that is the overarching theme of your submissions. And what that does ultimately is when you're setting out the theory of the case and the roadmap, it gives immediate clarity to where you're going to take the judges. And it's so important that you do that and not underestimate the value of that piece. in the first 60 seconds of your submissions, judges need to know what the case is about, what you want, and ultimately why, bottom line, you win. If they're confused in that 60 seconds, you've now spent, you and your partner are going to spend the next, I think the Lions Cup is 7 minutes per speaker. I could be mistaken, 7.5. You're going to spend the next effectively 14 minutes recovering from that, the lack of clarity in that first 60 seconds. Now, when it comes to actual submissions, as many of you either know or maybe you don't know, there's a lot of questions. Sometimes some benches are cold, some benches are hot. Um, it's so important not to fear questions. And in fact, I want you, when you go to the next moot, which is the Lions Cup, I believe, but even moots going forward, hunt for those questions. That's the mentality you need to have. The best mooters love questions. They love a hot bench. They invite these questions. They are opportunities for you to display your knowledge of the case, the record, the law, being able to answer hypotheticals. A lot of the time in moots, and in fact, it's not a lot of the time, always in moots, at the end of the day, it's treated as the last court. It's the apex court that's going to be making the final decision. No other court can overrule this court that you are before. So this is your opportunity to ultimately answer those hypotheticals, because those hypotheticals are going to matter. Because if they rule one way, now let's say, I know we're talking hypothetically, but all Canadian courts are now following this. Like, this is law. This is Bible. That's it. So hypotheticals are really important. And a lot of mooters make the critical error of saying, well, that's not what this is about. This case is about this. And ultimately, you want to say that at the very end, but you never want to leave a judge feeling like they can't ask that question. And in fact, it's going to be really important to you. And even if the hypothetical, you're listening to it and you're like, you know what, it actually supports the other side, you can absolutely make the you can say, well, yes, in that certain scenario, yes, it would support the Crown's position if you're representing the accused, for example. However, in that hypothetical, the reason it's different from our case is X, Y, Z, and that's why it wouldn't be applicable to our case. And in our case, this is why this matters, and this is why it needs to be applied like this. So it's really important to invite those types of questions. When judges are asking these questions, they're signaling to you that that is what is concerning to them, and that is actually what matters. And ultimately, in submissions, in a competition, that's where the case will likely turn in terms of who's going to win or lose the round. So you never want to shy away from those questions. Oh, sorry, I've got a fly here. Oh my, it's an erratic fly too. Um, Again, just to be clear, moot ultimately is a conversation. It's not a speech. It's not debate. That's not what this is. I know questions can be very scary because sometimes you might get a very, very hard question. Sometimes, like, in the moment, you're just sort of sitting there, or you're standing there rather, and you're thinking to yourself, I think I'm screwed right now, because that's a very difficult question. Breathe. Number one, pause. Think about it. And sometimes it might seem like a very long pause up there. It's probably not as long as you're feeling like it is. You can even ask for a brief indulgence. No one is ever going to be upset or dock you because you just say, Justice, that's a great question. If I could just have a moment to think about that. It also, to us, it signals, wow, you're actually going to give probably a very well thought out answer that you've truly taken a moment to think about. Never dodge questions. Just answer the question to the best of your ability, but then bridge it back to your submissions. There was a little trick I used to do if I got a question and I was answering, and just to, instead of saying, if I now to go back to my submissions, if I can go back to my submission, does that answer your question, Justice? That's never great. They'll let you know if you've answered the question or not. What you actually want to do is just seamlessly tie it back to what you were saying. Find a way to bridge what your answer to your back to your submissions, and say something to the effect of, and in fact, that brings me to my next submission, Justice. And then you can say whatever you were going to say. That's typically the best way to do it. Sometimes you're getting peppered by a judge, and you're giving left, right, so you're giving like a million answers. And by the way, this happens in court with me all the time. It happened to me a few weeks ago. I was in sentencing submissions, and the judge, just to give you a complete real world example, it was pretty serious. My client, no matter what, was going to jail. But we were arguing about the time. So I was arguing for a very short period, and the Crown was seeking, I think it was like 3 to 5 years. And I could see that the judge, I was making submissions on a certain area of case law on one of the charges, one of the counts. And I could see the judge and I were going back and forth. I think I answered in 3 different ways why it applies, why he should find that the lower range here is the appropriate tariff in my case. And I could see he was just not biting. And I think I said something to the effect of, well, Your Honor, and you don't use Your Honor, by the way, in appellate advocacy. I'm just, for my case was at the trial stage, or sentencing stage. But I said, well, Your Honor, I could see that my last 3 submissions on this point isn't, you don't necessarily have an appetite for. And I think what your concern is, more based on what I'm hearing right now, is Your Honor's concerned with this. And if Your Honor would like, I can move to that. I'm happy to move to that and answer those questions that Your Honor may have. And he was like, absolutely. Because I could hear that he was signaling me, like, he's like, I'm not gonna bite on this, but I could bite with respect to what I was going to say next, because I'd given him a roadmap in terms of what I was going to outline to the court. And that was very helpful for His Honor, and it was very helpful for my client, because I got my client the lower range. So sometimes you got to really watch for those cues, listen to the judges and what they're actually asking you and what they're saying to you, because they could be signaling to you, listen, I'm not necessarily on board with you right now. Why don't you move on? And that means also that you're really paying attention to them, and they're going to take note of that when they're deliberating, and in terms of your scores, and especially on day 2 when it's elimination rounds. I think just talking about that, I had an area I wanted to touch on, but I think this is a good way for me to just move to. Oh, JP.
I don't know. I mean, it's like the time for maybe a question. Now we get to turn the tables on
Totally.
Jen
I think
here.
that's
Justin's been waiting to pepper you with a question, I believe.
Oh gosh.
But I guess maybe on your point there, what is the biggest difference then on from day 1 to day 2 that if you're fortunate enough to make it to the second day, is it just continue on as normal, or what do you gotta sort of up your game to come across with a championship, or well, I guess the awards are already given up, but just a good showing on day 2?
Well, I mean, if you've gotten to day 2, you've done something right. So I wouldn't necessarily change too much at all. I mean, you're going to want to be prepared for more questions. You've got a larger bench on day 2 typically, and the judges increase typically. So from quarters all the way to finals, I think it's 357 or 579. So you want to be ready, and the time increases. So you want to be prepared for way more questions. and filling in that time appropriately. You don't want to have sort of like a lull in your submissions because you've prepped for only 7 minutes from day one, and then the next thing you know is you're up there on day two and you can't really fill up your time. I did see a question in the chat.
Yes, so it's what is your best advice for a first-time mooter? So there's been a lot of information today from the specifics of the case, crafting submissions, um, anticipating questions from the bench, as well as oral advocacy and courtroom or moot presence. What else do you think, or how would you summarize all of that into, hey, you're coaching a new team, let's say, and it's practice number one, and they're like, give us some wonderful words of wisdom, Jen. What would you share?
Oh, well, I mean, my previous mooters will tell you their first practice is just it's this stuff, going over this, but I throw them directly right into it. The first thing that we do is we break down the case. We talk about all the important issues, the majority and the dissent, what the key problems are, where they're directly in conflict, and we extract that. And then they start building their submissions right away. Um, for first-time mooters, practice, practice, practice. Like, I cannot stress that enough. You can't go to a competition with without doing a lot of practices in the lead up. Like, I recommend about 3 weeks of prep. And I'm talking about on an every other day sort of basis. For a few hours, you practice with your partner, find another team to practice with. Hopefully, you're fortunate enough that you go to a school where there's multiple teams. You practice together, because then you get to hear how they've built their submissions. And it's not necessarily copying. I mean, the arguments are all really there. If you're reading the factums, they're all there. Like, everything's there, but you get to see how people are answering questions and you learn off of each other. You might like someone's particular style in the way that they answer their questions. You want to be able to play off of that, and you build your own voice. I can't, and I will say, don't try to emulate anybody else. Don't try to be, I have to sound like this because that worked for that mooter. Do not do that. I was told to do that a couple times, and I will tell you, at those moots, I was very unsuccessful. I have a very different voice when it comes to mooting. Um, I'm a more confident speaker, and they were trying to get me to tone down and speak quietly and speak more. Like, I was like, it was very rigid. And I can't talk like that. I am a little bit more active. I don't want to say I'm performative, but I am a little bit more active, and it is my mooting voice. And when I use my mooting voice, I did really well because it was my voice that it's me. It's who I am. So, but the only way to figure that out is it's through practice. And hopefully that there's coaches, if you've got previous mooters on the team or previous mooters that come to mentor, take advantage of that. Do not shy away from practices. I know sometimes it can be pretty tedious, but you can learn a lot from those practices.
Hello, Jen.
Yes, I
Hi,
knew.
Justin.
So I think we both agree that understanding the case is much more important than, for instance, memorizing certain aspects or excerpts from the Supreme Court decision, and or maybe just as important. Can you speak to that? Just how important it is to understand the case and the implications of
Yeah.
what you're asking for?
Yeah, I mean, the findings of fact you're stuck with, right, at the trial stage. So you really want to know your record, because ultimately, at the end of the day, a moot comes down to, did the trial judge get it right or wrong? And the only way to be able to answer that question is to know what happened at trial. You need to know what the evidence was. If there are pre-trial motions and those were reported decisions, you want to know about that. You want to have it in your binder. You want to have it tabbed. You want key passages directly in your submissions in the event that you're asked a question about it. I can't emphasize enough that they really do matter. A lot of people think mooting is just about the law. It really isn't. Facts matter. Trial judges' decisions are owed a significant amount of deference. So you want to be able to respect that and respect the record. So, yeah, you really want, and you want to be able to use it. Don't be scared of using the facts. The facts matter ultimately.
Yeah, I think the best thing I ever heard was when you're in, of course, watching television and movies, we're like, oh, you're out there arguing the law and that's how it's perceived. But as I was told, you never really argue the law in court. You argue the facts, and the facts are what they are.
Yeah,
And you've been on both sides of the argument, both as a crown and now as a defense. And so I'm sure you can appreciate that even
yeah.
more. But I guess my last question would be, what is like Jen Loris Danny's morning routine day of Moo? Like, what are you doing to get ready? Are you just chilling? You having a latte, or are you in the books?
So I don't have a cup of coffee. It's the one thing I don't do. Um, I'll do it for court. That's I don't know, but like when I was like as a competitor, Justin, I'm assuming that's what you're asking me about.
I am, yeah. No, not as a judge or an organizer, but as a competitor.
Yeah, as a competitor, I didn't have coffee in the morning. I think it made me too jittery, and I'm already a very active person as it is. Like I have not had a cup of coffee today. I already sound pretty energetic. So it doesn't, for me, it doesn't make sense. I listen to really upbeat music while I'm getting ready. A lot of
Yeah, what's in the playlist? The real hard
I
hitting questions are coming now, Jen.
oh
It's like seven
no.
Beyonce songs back to back.
Yeah, like it's stuff like it's like girl boss music.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for
It's
sure.
definitely girl boss music. Anything about like, dunking on everybody else, get your bag, like and- anything to just hype me up and build my confidence, which I still do.
Oh yeah.
Before
Jen
trials.
walks into the Ontario Court of Justice with all I do is win, win, win.
Well, like, like all jokes aside, I think there is this misconception that like you just one day, get so comfortable that there's never those nerves or what you need to get in the mode. But I would actually counter that. I've been doing it for 10 years, and to this day, giving submissions, it's still a little nerve-wracking. And so I think, even when you're doing mooting, it aligns you properly with learning how to give oral advocates, great oral advocacy.
Yeah.
But I think once you lose that fear or that not that fear, but that nervousness, you probably should hang it up because you're more prone to make mistakes, I think.
That's actually you gotta bang on. One of my old boss and a long time mentor of mine told me the same thing. He's been practicing for, oh, I'm gonna age him quite a bit, like 30 years,
Boy,
35 years. Oh yeah.
I was like,
And
damn, like Kevin Hart, damn.
yeah, like, he is, I mean, he's incredible and he's so good in court, but he still gets the nerves.
Yeah,
And he's like, that is what separates a good lawyer from a great lawyer. Like you get the nerves because your case matters.
that's right.
There's stakes here, and you should be a little nervous. And in your submissions, if you're up there and you don't feel any nerves at all, that's actually not normal. My last smooth that I ever did in law school, um, I was nervous. Um, I was scared. I was scared. And I was in front of like real judges, like real, like my first round was three real judges from three different provinces, like Ontario, Alberta, and Manitoba.
Oh my God, what a hodgepodge.
Yeah, yeah. And our case was La France, and the Alberta judge, was from the same courthouse of the original trial decision, which means that he probably knew the case very, very well. Oh, and it showed. Um, so yeah, I mean, nerves, it's okay to be nervous, and I'm still nervous. I still get nervous. I'm always like a little worried. I'm like, what if I just say the wrong thing and then I get eaten alive by the judge, like completely rip my head off? Which happens, by the way. It totally
If you're the
happens.
judge and Justin's the judge, certainly.
Well, even judges in court, like
Yeah.
again, so it's almost like becoming an adult, right? Like there's this like idea where you just one day you're like, oh, I drink coffee, I do things that are adult like, but it's just this continuous you, and then you just have more responsibilities and obligations. And I find the law to be quite similar. You're always waiting for that moment where you're like, when am I the seasoned paralegal or lawyer? And then you look and then you just realize that your knowledge that you've gained through your time is what makes you, the knowledgeable one, right? And so, but you never really feel that moment where it's just like, yeah, I'm the guy now, right? I'm the woman, right? I'm that girl, and so it's important for even at this level where you're just starting to get into advocacy through mooting to know that to like, to understand what to expect and how to traverse the feelings you get when we all get those imposter syndrome feelings.
I was just about to say, like, I still have imposter
Yeah,
syndrome. Like,
exactly.
I was a paralegal for what, 8 years? I don't even remember. Now I don't remember. eight
One of the
years,
tribe.
counsel now for almost 2 years. And I have so much court experience. I have so much trial experience.
Yeah.
I'm in court day in, day out, and I have imposter syndrome like you wouldn't believe.
That's a
And that like I don't belong sometimes and I get scared. I have my days. Um, but then yeah, you're right. Like 5 years ago, I could not imagine doing the things I'm doing now 5 years
yeah.
ago. Like it's beyond me. And
Yeah.
knowing the things I know that I could not have possibly like things that are effortless to me now that just come like I could do with my hands tied behind my back blindfolded.
Yeah.
And 5 years ago, I'm like cramming in law school, trying to understand these concepts and crying over my computer that I was never going to pass the exam.
I know JP's like pulling his hair out because we're going complete tangent, but I'll just end
It's
this by saying,
okay. No.
as a teacher, and I'm sure JP can also speak to this. Like, you get the ability to understand the actual chasm of knowledge when you see individuals who have never been exposed to any type of, like, for instance, criminal laws, as I've been doing for 10 years. And so things that you just said are second nature now, or second, like, like the back of your hand. Individuals, it sounds like to them you're speaking Chinese to them, or Indian, right? And so and that's where sometimes we get that, oh, okay, yeah, you know what, I guess we do know more than, and as JP can tell you, as a teacher, you want to talk about imposter syndrome, you're always waiting for that, like, email, like, I caught you don't know what you're talking about, you're fired, right?
And sometimes in the moment you just sort of have to kind of wing it. You're like, if they
Fake
say
it till you
something to
make
you
it.
in court and you're like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah,
Don't
I
use
don't know what you're
generative
talking.
AI.
you gotta, in those
Get
points
the
you got to use
hallucinatory
those.
case law there. Don't try
Oh, you have,
Yeah.
you know what? I've even personally, like, I recently, in fact, saw it with someone who's a lawyer who sent me materials to rely on because we had a similar case and gave me AI slop with
Oh.
hallucinated cases. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I can't even believe I'm in this world.
uh
What is
Uh-oh.
going on here?
wait,
That's for the after the
yeah, I was gonna
recording
say
turns down
things are
tea.
starting to make sense now all of a sudden, Jen.
But anyhow, thank you so much, Jed and Justin, and I'll just quickly wrap up and happy to continue any other conversation there. For anyone here who is interested and maybe want to schedule like a quick, here's my submissions. If you can pass the mustard with Justin or Jen or myself, I think you'll be in good shape for the Lions Cup or beyond. And we'll try to help out as much as we can. And anyone listening to this recording, thank you all, and thanks to all the amazing championship pedigree speakers we've had throughout the day, from Anna Sophia to Neha to Avery to Michaela and now Jen, and happy to coordinate it. It makes it very easy to put on an event like this when you just have people who buy in, and hope to see all of you at the Lions Cup. I think Jen and I have to defend our best dressed judges titles, I believe. So I got to go
I've
sleep.
already got a couple outfits ready to go.
Yeah.
But we're looking forward to putting all this into practice, and hope to see you there or at any future moots. And feel free to reach out if you do want any guidance. We're happy to help. And thank you all for joining us. And I guess we'll have Mooting 102 in the near future to build on this. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone. Good luck.